On the coldest morning of 1826, a 19-year-old bride was cast out of her own wedding home before the sun could rise. The Duke of Ashcroft, one of England's most powerful nobles, banished his wife to a desolate cottage on the edge of his estate, convinced she was nothing more than a fortune-hunting pawn in her father's schemes. Society watched, whispered, and condemned her without trial. But what happened next would shake the foundations of English aristocracy and prove that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in power, but in quiet endurance. Stay until the end to see how a woman written off as worthless became the one person who could bring a ruthless duke to his knees. Drop a like and comment which city you're watching from. The Great Hall of Ashcroft Manor blazed with 1,000 candles on the evening of December 14th, 1826. Their light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors in a display of wealth that would have fed a village for a year. Lady Eliza Hawthorne stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that had cost more than her family's monthly expenses, her small hands trembling as she held a bouquet of winter roses that seemed to mock the ice forming in her chest. Across from her stood Duke Rowan Ashcroft, a man of 32 whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. Tall and severe, with dark hair swept back from a face carved from granite, he looked at her with eyes the color of slate, cold, assessing, revealing nothing. He had barely spoken to her during their brief courtship, if the 3 formal meetings arranged by their families could even be called that. Each encounter had been stiff, proper, conducted under the watchful eyes of chaperones who ensured that nothing approaching genuine conversation could take place. The Archbishop's words washed over Eliza like water over stone, meaningless sounds that bound her to a stranger. When it came time to say her vows, her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "I will." Rowan's response was crisp, mechanical, devoid of warmth. "I will." The kiss that sealed their union lasted less than a second, his lips touching hers with all the warmth of pressing against marble. Then it was done. She was the Duchess of Ashcroft, whether she wanted to be or not. The wedding breakfast that followed was an elaborate performance. 300 guests filled the manor's grand dining room, their chatter filling the space with noise that Eliza found overwhelming. She sat beside her new husband at the head table, acutely aware that he had not looked at her once since they'd left the altar. "Your Grace," she ventured quietly, trying to start some conversation, any conversation. "The manor is beautiful. I look forward to learning its halls." He didn't turn his head. "I'm sure you do." The words carried an edge she didn't understand. Before she could ask what he meant, a servant appeared with another course, and the moment passed. Across the room, Eliza's father, Lord Edmund Hawthorne, laughed too loudly at something one of the Duke's associates had said. Her father had always laughed too loudly, a nervous habit that intensified when he was uncomfortable. Eliza watched him with a mixture of love and sadness. Once, Edmund Hawthorne had been a respected landowner, a man of modest means but good standing. Then had come the bad investments, the failed ventures, the slow bleeding of fortune that he'd tried desperately to hide from society. Eliza knew the truth, though he'd tried to shield her from it. She'd seen the creditors at their door, heard the whispered arguments between her parents late at night. She'd known, with a sinking certainty, that this marriage was the solution her father had sought, a union that would erase debts and restore the Hawthorne name to respectability. What she hadn't known, until 2 weeks before the wedding, was that her father's debts were not born of greed or gambling or any of the vices that typically ruined men of his class. Edmund Hawthorne's fortune had disappeared because he'd spent it helping people, paying medical bills for tenants who couldn't afford doctors, buying food during harsh winters, funding the education of village children who showed promise. He had been generous to a fault, literally, and his kindness had bankrupted him. Eliza had sold everything she owned to help, every piece of jewelry her mother had left her, every valuable she'd possessed. It hadn't been enough. The marriage to Duke Ashcroft had been the only way to save her father from debtor's prison. She'd accepted it willingly, telling herself that perhaps affection might grow between her and the Duke over time. Surely no marriage began with passionate love. Surely respect and companionship could be built, brick by careful brick. Now, sitting beside this cold stranger as aristocrats toasted their union with champagne, she felt the first whispers of doubt. The celebration continued for hours. Eliza smiled until her face ached, accepted congratulations from people whose names she would never remember, and tried to ignore the pitying looks from some of the older women. They knew, she realized. They knew what kind of man Rowan Ashcroft was, and they felt sorry for her. "He's never been warm," whispered the Countess of Berkshire, an elderly woman who'd known Rowan since childhood. She'd cornered Eliza near the refreshment table, her papery hand gripping Eliza's arm with surprising strength. "But there's reasons for it, child. His mother, well, what happened to her would freeze any boy's heart." "What happened?" Eliza asked, but the Countess was already being pulled away by her companion, leaving the statement hanging in the air like smoke. As the evening wore on, servants began clearing plates and refilling glasses. The musicians struck up a waltz, and couples moved to the center of the room to dance. Rowan stood abruptly, offering Eliza his hand with all the enthusiasm of a man approaching the gallows. They took their position on the dance floor, his hand at her waist, hers on his shoulder. The music began, and they moved through the steps with technical precision and zero warmth. "You dance well, Your Grace," Eliza offered, trying again. "It's a required skill," he replied flatly. "Perhaps we might talk after the guests have gone. I would like to know more about the manor, about our responsibilities here." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We'll discuss matters as necessary." She felt something inside her wither. This was to be her life then, married to a man who could barely stand to speak to her. The dance ended mercifully quickly, and Rowan escorted her back to her seat before disappearing into the crowd of male guests, leaving her alone. The hours crawled by. Finally, mercifully, the last guest departed. The servants began the enormous task of cleaning up, and Eliza found herself being led upstairs by the head housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, a stern-faced woman in her 50s. "His Grace's chambers are in the east wing," Mrs. Pemberton said as they climbed the grand staircase. "Yours are in the west. You'll have separate apartments, as is proper." Separate apartments. Of course. Everything about this marriage was separate. The Duchess's chambers were magnificent. 3 rooms, including a bedroom larger than the entire ground floor of the Hawthorne country house. The bed was a massive 4-poster draped in silk. The furniture was French, and everything spoke of wealth and taste and profound loneliness. "Will His Grace be joining me?" Eliza asked quietly. Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened slightly, the first hint of sympathy Eliza had seen from any of the Ashcroft staff. "I couldn't say, Your Grace, but I'll have your lady's maid help you prepare for bed." An hour later, Eliza sat in a nightgown of fine linen, her long auburn hair brushed and hanging loose down her back. The maid had gone. The fire burned low in the grate. And she waited. And waited. The clock on the mantel ticked past 11. Then midnight. Then 1 in the morning. He wasn't coming. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry on her wedding night. She would not give in to despair, not yet. Perhaps he was simply tired. Perhaps tomorrow would be better. She had just convinced herself to blow out the candles and attempt sleep when her chamber door crashed open. Rowan stood in the doorway, still in his wedding clothes, his cravat loosened and his dark hair disheveled. But it was his eyes that made Eliza's breath catch. They burned with a fury that seemed barely contained. "Your Grace?" She stood, pulling her robe tighter around herself. "Is something wrong?" He strode into the room, and she could smell brandy on him. Not drunk, but he'd been drinking. In his hand he held papers, documents of some kind. "Is something wrong?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Is something wrong? I don't understand. No, I'm sure you don't." He threw the papers onto her dressing table. "I'm sure you have no idea what these are. I'm sure you're entirely innocent in this whole sordid affair." Eliza's heart began to pound. "What affair? What are you talking about?" "Your father's debts." The words exploded from him. £50,000. £50,000 in debt to half the moneylenders in London? And did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could trap me in this marriage without my discovering exactly what kind of family I've tied myself to?" The blood drained from Eliza's face. Yes, my father had debts, but they were the reason for this marriage." Rowan cut her off, pacing like a caged wolf. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. You and your calculating father saw a wealthy duke, and you set your trap beautifully. A pretty daughter, a few well-placed introductions, and now here we are, your family's financial ruin solved by my fortune. That's not... It wasn't like that, Eliza protested, finding her voice. Yes, the marriage helped my father's situation, but I didn't trap you. Our families arranged this, as families do. You could have refused, could I? He whirled on her, and she took an involuntary step back. When your father came to me speaking of honor and promises made between our fathers years ago, when half of society was already whispering about the engagement before I'd even agreed to it, I was maneuvered into this marriage as surely as a piece on a chessboard, and you... He looked at her with such contempt that she felt it like a physical blow. You played your part perfectly. The shy, innocent girl, the modest manner, all of it calculated to make me believe this was anything other than what it is, a transaction. You're wrong. Eliza's voice shook, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. My father's debts were not from greed or vice. He spent his fortune helping people, his tenants, the poor in our village. He's a good man who gave too much, and yes, I agreed to this marriage to help him. But I also agreed because I thought perhaps we might build something real together. Rowan laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. Build something real? I've seen what happens when men build things with women they trust. I watched my father waste away after my mother's betrayal, watched him become a shell of a man because he believed in love and partnership. I learned young that marriages are contracts, nothing more, and anyone who pretends otherwise is a fool or a liar. What betrayal? Eliza asked quietly. What happened to your mother? That, he said coldly, is none of your concern. What is your concern is this. You have what you wanted. You're a duchess. Your father's debts are cleared. The marriage contract is signed and witnessed. But if you think for one moment that I will play the part of the doting husband, that I will pretend this is anything other than what it is, you are gravely mistaken. Eliza felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. What are you saying? I'm saying that you will remain here as the Duchess of Ashcroft in name only. You will have your allowance, your position in society, all the material benefits you schemed for, but you will not have me. You will not have my trust, my companionship, or my presence. But I'm not finished. He moved closer, and Eliza saw something in his eyes that frightened her. Not rage, but something colder. Resolve. In fact, you will not remain here at all. There is a cottage on the far edge of the estate, near the village of Thornfield. It's suitable for occupation, if barely. You will be removed there tomorrow. The words didn't make sense at first. Removed? You're sending me away? On the day after our wedding? Before dawn, actually. I see no reason to prolong this farce. The servants are already preparing the cottage and packing your things. Eliza stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. You're exiling me. You're sending your wife away like some unwanted servant. I'm providing you with lodging appropriate to your station as my wife, simply at a location where you won't be a constant reminder of how thoroughly I've been deceived. His voice was perfectly calm now, which somehow made it worse. You'll have a modest household, an allowance, and the protection of the Ashcroft name. Many women in arranged marriages have far less. But what will people say? The scandal will be managed. I'll put it about that you prefer the country to the city, that you're delicate and need the quiet for your health. Society will whisper, of course, but society always whispers. They'll tire of it eventually. Eliza felt tears sliding down her cheeks now, hot and shameful. Please, if you would just listen. I'm done listening. He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. For just a moment, something flickered in his expression, something that might have been regret or doubt. But it was gone before she could be sure. I'd advise you to get what sleep you can. The carriage leaves at dawn. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that sounded like a sentence being passed. Eliza stood alone in her magnificent chamber, in her wedding nightgown, and felt her entire world collapse. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body shaking with sobs she'd tried so hard to contain. This couldn't be happening. She'd married him mere hours ago. She was supposed to be beginning a new life, and instead, it was ending before it had even started. The worst part was that she understood his anger about the debts. If she'd been in his position, learned about the financial circumstances on her wedding day, she might have felt manipulated too. But he wouldn't listen. He'd made up his mind about who she was, what she wanted, and nothing she said could penetrate that wall of cold certainty. She cried until she had no tears left, until her eyes were swollen and her throat raw. Then she sat in silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, and made a decision. If Rowan Ashcroft wanted to exile her, she would go. She would take his cottage and his allowance and his name. But she would not break. She would not give him the satisfaction of destroying her. She had survived her mother's death when she was 12, survived watching her father's slow financial ruin, survived the pressure of knowing her marriage was her family's last hope. She would survive this too. When the maid came to wake her 2 hours later, Eliza was already dressed in a simple traveling gown, her face washed, her hair pinned up with practiced efficiency. She'd packed a small bag of her most precious possessions, the few things she'd brought from her childhood home, including a miniature portrait of her mother. Mrs. Pemberton waited at the bottom of the stairs, her expression carefully neutral. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace." "Thank you." Eliza descended the stairs with her back straight, her head high. If she was to be cast out, she would leave with dignity. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute as she stepped outside. A simple carriage waited, nothing like the elaborate coach she'd arrived in yesterday. Her trunks were already loaded. A single driver sat in the box, huddled against the cold. Eliza looked back at Ashcroft Manor one last time. Somewhere in those vast halls, Rowan was probably sleeping, already putting her out of his mind. The thought sent a fresh stab of pain through her chest, but she forced it down. "I'm ready," she told Mrs. Pemberton. The housekeeper's stern facade cracked for just a moment. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, I think this is wrong, dead wrong, but it's not my place to say so." "Thank you for saying it anyway." Eliza climbed into the carriage. As they pulled away, she didn't look back again. The manor disappeared into the darkness behind her, and with it, the brief, brutal marriage that had lasted less than a day. The journey to Thornfield took 3 hours over roads that grew progressively worse. Dawn broke gray and cold, revealing a landscape of rolling hills covered in frost. They passed through villages where smoke rose from chimneys, and farmers were already at work, people living ordinary lives untouched by the drama of aristocratic marriages. Finally, they turned down a narrow lane rutted with frozen mud and stopped in front of a small stone cottage. It sat alone at the edge of a village, surrounded by barren fields and wind-bent trees. The building was old, but appeared structurally sound, with a thatched roof that had seen better days and windows that were blessedly intact. This was to be her home, her exile. The driver helped her down and began unloading her trunks. Eliza approached the cottage door and pushed it open. Inside was cold. There'd been no fire lit in preparation, but cleaner than she'd expected. Someone had made an effort. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, one bedroom, and that was all. The furniture was simple but serviceable. Compared to the Duchess's apartment she'd occupied for all of 3 hours, it was tiny. Compared to many people's homes, she knew, it was more than adequate. "Will you be all right, Your Grace?" the driver asked, setting the last trunk inside. "Yes," Eliza said, though she wasn't sure it was true. "Thank you." He looked doubtful but nodded and left. She heard the carriage rattle away, leaving her in absolute silence. Eliza stood in the center of her new home and took a shaky breath. Then another. She would not cry again. She was done crying. She found wood stacked beside the fireplace and kindling in a box. Someone had thought ahead. Her fingers were numb with cold as she worked to start a fire, but eventually she got flames going. The heat began to spread slowly through the small space. She had no servants, she realized. The Duke had sent her here with nothing but her belongings. She would have to learn to care for herself, something she'd never done before. Ladies of her station didn't cook or clean or tend fires. Well, she thought grimly, she would learn. The first day passed in a haze of survival. She found bread and cheese in the kitchen, supplies left by whoever had prepared the cottage. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing. She unpacked one trunk, hanging her fine dresses in a wardrobe that seemed designed to mock their elegance. She made the bed with sheets she'd brought from Ashcroft Manor, monogrammed with an A she now had the right to use, but probably never would. As darkness fell, she heard voices outside. Villagers, probably, curious about the stranger who'd arrived that morning. But no one knocked on her door, and she was grateful for that small mercy. She lay in the narrow bed that night, listening to the wind howl around the cottage, and thought about her husband. Was he relieved she was gone? Did he think about her at all? Probably not. To him, she was just a problem solved, tucked away where he didn't have to look at her or think about the marriage he'd been trapped into. Fine. If he wanted to forget her, she would let him. But she would not forget herself. She would not let this exile define her. Somehow, in this cold cottage at the edge of nowhere, Eliza Ashcroft, for she was still technically a duchess, even in banishment, would find a way to live. The days that followed were the hardest of Eliza's life. She'd grown up privileged, sheltered from the realities of daily survival, and now she was confronted with them all at once. The fire went out in the night, and she woke shivering, having to restart it with frozen fingers. Her attempt at cooking breakfast resulted in burned porridge that she ate anyway because she was starving and didn't know when she'd manage to make something edible. On the third day, there was a knock at the door. Eliza opened it to find a woman perhaps 10 years older than herself, wrapped in a worn shawl, holding a basket. "Begging your pardon, miss, or m'lady, I should say." The woman bobbed an awkward curtsy. "I'm Sarah Miller, from the village. We heard someone new had come to the cottage, and I thought you might need some help settling in." Eliza's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "That's very kind of you." Sarah looked past her into the cottage, and Eliza saw her take in the smoking fireplace, the evidence of Eliza's failed cooking attempts. "You've had some trouble with the hearth, I think." I haven't done this before," Eliza admitted. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "Let me show you a few things if you like. And I brought some bread from this morning's baking and a pot of soup that just needs warming." For the first time since her exile began, Eliza felt something other than despair. "Please, come in. And thank you, truly." Sarah Miller became the first of what would eventually be several villagers who helped Eliza navigate her new life. The kindness wasn't universal. Many people stayed away, whether from respect for the nobility or fear of offending the powerful Duke of Ashcroft. Eliza wasn't sure. But Sarah, and a few others like her, seemed to see past the titles and circumstances to the young woman struggling to survive. "What brings a fine lady like yourself to our village?" Sarah asked one day as she showed Eliza how to properly tend a garden plot behind the cottage. Eliza had prepared a lie. The story about delicate health and preferring the country that Rowan had suggested. But something about Sarah's open, honest face made her want to tell at least part of the truth. "My marriage didn't begin as I'd hoped," she said carefully. "This seemed the best solution for everyone." Sarah nodded, asking no further questions, and Eliza was grateful for the discretion. Weeks passed. Eliza learned to cook simple meals, to keep a fire burning, to mend her own clothes when they tore. She learned the rhythms of village life, so different from the aristocratic world she'd known. People here worked from dawn to dusk, their lives governed by seasons and harvests rather than social calendars and balls. One day in late January, Eliza encountered a group of children playing in the village square. They stopped when they saw her, staring with wide eyes at the fine lady in the cottage. "Do you know your letters?" Eliza asked them on impulse. They shook their heads. Of course they didn't. Village children rarely had access to education. "Would you like to learn?" That simple question changed everything. Within a week, Eliza had 6 children coming to her cottage 3 times a week for lessons. She taught them to read using books she'd brought from Ashcroft Manor, volumes she'd assumed she'd never look at again, but which now served a purpose she'd never imagined. The children were bright and eager, soaking up knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. Their parents were grateful and began showing their appreciation in small ways. A basket of eggs here, help mending the cottage roof there. Slowly, Eliza began to feel less like an exile and more like a member of a community. But the nights were still hard. Alone in her cottage, with the wind howling and the darkness pressing in, she couldn't help but think about Rowan. She wondered what he was doing in his grand manor, whether he ever thought about the wife he'd cast out. She wondered if she would spend the rest of her life in this cottage, married but utterly alone, a duchess in nothing but name. The anger she'd felt initially had faded, replaced by a deep sadness. Not for the life she'd lost. She was discovering she didn't really want that life anyway, but for what might have been, if Rowan had given her a chance, if he'd listened instead of judging, if his heart hadn't been so thoroughly frozen by whatever had happened in his past. She thought about the Countess of Berkshire's words. What happened to her would freeze any boy's heart. What had happened? What had made Rowan so incapable of trust? Not that it mattered now. He'd made his choice, and she'd made hers. She would survive this exile. She would build a life worth living, even if it wasn't the life she'd imagined. And in the cold nights, when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, she reminded herself that she was stronger than she'd ever known. She'd been tested and not found wanting. Whatever came next, she would endure it. Miles away, in Ashcroft Manor, Rowan Ashcroft sat in his study and tried to convince himself he'd made the right decision. The gossip reached London within a fortnight. In the glittering drawing rooms of Mayfair, over tea served in bone china cups worth more than a working man's yearly wages, society whispered about the Duke of Ashcroft's mysterious bride. The wedding had been lavish, the guest list impeccable, and yet the new duchess had vanished as quickly as morning mist. "Consumption, I heard," Lady Pembroke murmured to her circle at an afternoon salon. "Sent away for her health. Poor thing probably won't last the year." "Nonsense," countered the Marchioness of Weatherby, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "I have it on excellent authority that she was caught in a compromising position with a footman. The Duke exiled her in disgrace." "You're both wrong," declared Mrs. Whitmore, wife of a prominent banker. "The girl's father bankrupted himself with gambling and loose women. The Duke discovered it after the wedding and wanted nothing to do with tainted blood." None of them knew the truth, but that hardly mattered. In the absence of facts, society created its own narrative, and that narrative was rarely kind to women. The stories grew more elaborate with each retelling. Eliza Hawthorne, now Ashcroft in name only, became a cautionary tale, a symbol of whatever moral failing the speaker wished to condemn. She was sickly, scandalous, mercenary, mad. She was everything wrong with modern marriages, proof that love matches were folly, and arranged unions led only to ruin. At Ashcroft Manor, Rowan heard the whispers and did nothing to stop them. He'd told his household to spread the story about delicate health and preference for country air, but he'd underestimated society's hunger for scandal. The truth was far simpler and far uglier than any of the rumors, but he had no intention of sharing it. He threw himself into estate business with an intensity that bordered on obsession. There were ledgers to review, investments to manage, tenant disputes to settle. He rode out to inspect his lands every day, returning exhausted enough that sleep came, without the dreams that had plagued him since childhood. He did not think about Eliza. He refused to think about her. But Mrs. Pemberton thought about her constantly. The housekeeper had served the Ashcroft family for 30 years, had known Rowan since he was a boy of 7, whose mother had just abandoned him. She'd watched him grow from a wounded child into a hard man, and she understood why. But understanding didn't mean approval. "It's been 6 weeks, Your Grace," she said one morning as she supervised the breakfast service. "Perhaps you should inquire about the Duchess's welfare." Rowan didn't look up from his newspaper. "She has an allowance and a roof over her head. What more welfare does she require?" "She's your wife." "In name only, as we've established." He turned a page with deliberate casualness. "The arrangement suits us both." "Does it?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried an edge Rowan had rarely heard from her. "Forgive my boldness, Your Grace, but you don't seem suited by anything. You barely eat, you work yourself to exhaustion, and you've grown even more withdrawn than usual." "Your concern is noted and dismissed." Rowan stood, abandoning his untouched breakfast. "I'll be riding to the eastern farms today. Don't expect me before dark." He left before she could respond, but her words followed him like shadows. The truth was that Rowan wasn't sleeping well. Not because of guilt. He refused to feel guilty for protecting himself from a mercenary marriage, but because of doubt. Small, insidious doubts that crept in during the quiet moments he couldn't fill with work. The way Eliza had looked at him on their wedding night, her face pale with shock and hurt. The tremble in her voice when she'd tried to explain about her father. The tears streaming down her cheeks as he'd pronounced her sentence. He'd expected anger or manipulation, threats or bargaining. Instead, she'd simply stood there, taking blow after blow, absorbing his fury like a target absorbing arrows, and something about that had unsettled him far more than dramatics would have. But doubt wasn't certainty, and Rowan had learned long ago that trusting doubt led to weakness. He'd made his decision based on clear evidence: her father's massive debts, the suspicious timing of the marriage proposal, the calculated nature of the whole affair. Those facts hadn't changed. What had changed, though he wouldn't admit it, was his conviction that he understood what those facts meant. March arrived with bitter winds and occasional snow. At the cottage in Thornfield, Eliza's small school had grown to 12 children ranging from ages 5 to 13. She taught them in shifts now, the youngest in the mornings and the older ones in the afternoons, using every book she owned and several borrowed from the village church. Your Grace, 10-year-old Thomas Harper said one afternoon, stumbling over the proper form of address as he always did. Why does the K in night not make a sound? Because English is a wonderfully illogical language, Eliza replied with a smile that had become more genuine as the weeks passed. It borrowed from French and Latin and German and decided to keep the strangest parts of each. The children laughed, and Eliza felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in her small hearth. This wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it had become something she valued. These children looked at her not as a duchess or a scandal or a cautionary tale, but simply as someone who cared enough to teach them. My pa says you're too fine for our village, Thomas continued with the blunt honesty of childhood. Says the Duke must have done something terrible to make you come here. The other children froze, sensing they'd crossed into forbidden territory. Eliza felt her smile falter, but forced it back into place. Your father is half right, she said carefully. I am fortunate to be here, teaching all of you. Now, shall we practice writing those silent letters? After the lessons ended and the children scattered home, Sarah Miller arrived with a basket of mending and her usual good company. They're starting to talk in the village, Sarah said without preamble as she settled into the chair across from Eliza. About you and the Duke. Eliza's hand stilled on the sock she was darning. What are they saying? The usual nonsense that you did something to displease him, that he's keeping you here as punishment, that you're not really married at all. Sarah's needle moved with practiced efficiency through a torn shirt. I tell them to mind their own affairs, but you know how people are. I do. Eliza had hoped the isolation of Thornfield would spare her from society's judgment, but apparently gossip respected no boundaries. Does it bother them that I'm teaching their children? Some are grateful, some are suspicious. Mrs. Blackwood thinks you're putting ideas above their station in their heads. Mr. Fletcher says his daughter Jenny has never been happier than when she's learning her letters. Sarah looked up, her expression thoughtful. You've caused quite a stir, Your Grace, just by being kind. I'm not being kind, Eliza protested. I'm being selfish. Teaching gives me purpose. Without it, I'd go mad in this cottage with nothing but my thoughts. That's the thing about kindness, though, isn't it? The reason behind it matters less than the doing of it. Before Eliza could respond, they heard shouting outside. Both women went to the window and saw a crowd gathering in the village square, unusual for a weekday afternoon when most people should have been working. What's happening? Eliza asked. Sarah's face had gone pale. That's the magistrate's carriage, and those are constables. They grabbed their shawls and hurried toward the commotion. A crowd of perhaps 40 villagers had gathered around a young man Eliza recognized as Peter Collins, Sarah's nephew. He was being held by two constables, while a well-dressed man, presumably the magistrate, read from an official-looking document. Peter Collins, you are charged with poaching on the lands of His Grace, the Duke of Ashcroft. Witnesses report seeing you in the Duke's forest 3 nights past, with snares and a hunting knife. I wasn't poaching, Peter shouted, struggling against the men holding him. I was checking my own traps on common land. The land in question was enclosed last month by ducal decree, the magistrate continued. All hunting rights now belong exclusively to His Grace. Sarah grabbed Eliza's arm. They're going to hang him, she whispered, her voice breaking. Or transport him. Peter's all his mother has left since his father died. Eliza's mind raced. Poaching was indeed a serious crime, punishable by death in extreme cases, transportation to Australia at minimum. But if Peter had been on what he believed was common land, if the enclosure was recent and not well publicized, she stepped forward before she could think better of it. Excuse me, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. I am the Duchess of Ashcroft. Perhaps I can be of assistance. The crowd parted, suddenly silent. The magistrate looked at her with barely concealed surprise. And something else. Contempt? No, Eliza realized. Pity. Your Grace. He offered a perfunctory bow. I wasn't aware you were residing in this area. I am, as you can see. Eliza kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered. What evidence exists that this young man was poaching? Witnesses saw him in the enclosed forest with hunting equipment. Were any animals found in his possession? Any proof he'd actually taken game? The magistrate's jaw tightened. The intent to poach is crime enough. But intent is harder to prove than action, surely. Eliza moved closer, positioning herself between the constables and Peter. If the enclosure is recent, many locals might not yet be aware of the new boundaries. An honest mistake, particularly in the dark of night, seems more likely than deliberate criminal intent. The law doesn't recognize honest mistakes in matters of poaching, Your Grace. No, but the Duke might recognize the difference between a hardened criminal and a confused young man. Eliza was making this up as she went, her mind working frantically. I will personally speak to my husband about this matter. I'm certain he would prefer mercy in cases of potential misunderstanding rather than harsh punishment that might breed resentment among his tenants. The magistrate's expression flickered with doubt. He clearly hadn't expected the exiled duchess to intervene, let alone to invoke her husband's authority. Your Grace, I appreciate your compassion, but the Duke's instructions regarding poachers were quite clear. Were they? Eliza interrupted, her voice sharpening. Did he specifically instruct you to show no mercy in cases of disputed boundaries and unclear intent? Or are you perhaps being overzealous in your interpretation of his wishes? The crowd was watching now with something approaching hope. The magistrate looked between Eliza and Peter, clearly calculating the risks of defying a duchess, even an exiled one, against the certainty of the Duke's wrath if he showed unwarranted leniency. I suppose, he said slowly, the matter could be delayed until Your Grace has the opportunity to consult with the Duke. Excellent. Eliza's relief was almost dizzying. Release Mr. Collins into my custody. I will take full responsibility for ensuring he appears for judgment once I've discussed the situation with my husband. The magistrate clearly wanted to refuse, but with the entire village watching and a duchess, however disgraced, asserting her authority, he had little choice. He gestured to the constables, who reluctantly released Peter. You have 1 week, Your Grace, the magistrate said stiffly. If the Duke wishes to press charges, Mr. Collins will be arrested immediately. Understood. Thank you for your restraint in this matter. The magistrate departed with his constables, leaving Eliza standing in the village square with every eye upon her. Peter's mother rushed forward and grabbed Eliza's hands. Thank you, Your Grace. Thank you, you've saved my boy. I've delayed his arrest, Mrs. Collins. I haven't saved him yet. Eliza felt the weight of what she'd just done settling on her shoulders. She'd promised to speak to Rowan, but Rowan wouldn't speak to her. He'd exiled her precisely to avoid having to deal with her. She'd just committed herself to confronting the one person in England who despised her most. Sarah stepped close, her voice low. Can you really help Peter? I don't know, Eliza admitted, but I have to try. The crowd slowly dispersed, though Eliza could feel their gazes following her back to the cottage. She'd inserted herself into village affairs in a way that couldn't be undone. For better or worse, she was no longer just the exiled duchess hiding in isolation. She'd made herself responsible for one of their own. That night, Eliza sat at her small table and tried to compose a letter to Rowan. She went through 6 drafts, each more desperate than the last, before finally settling on something simple and direct. Your Grace, a young man from Thornfield Village has been accused of poaching on recently enclosed land. I believe the charge stems from honest confusion rather than criminal intent. I ask that you show mercy and withdraw the prosecution. I would not trouble you with this matter except that the young man's widowed mother depends upon him entirely. Respectfully, E. Ashcroft. She sealed it and gave it to the postwriter the next morning, knowing the response would likely be silence or refusal. Rowan had made his feelings about her clear. Why would he grant her any favors? 3 days passed with no reply. Eliza continued teaching, but the anxiety gnawed at her constantly. Peter Collins avoided the forest entirely, staying close to home, but everyone knew that wouldn't matter if the Duke insisted on prosecution. On the fourth day, a rider came from Ashcroft Manor. Eliza's hand shook as she accepted the sealed letter. She recognized Rowan's bold handwriting on the outside. Inside was a single sentence. "The charges are dropped. Do not write to me again." Relief and anger warred in Eliza's chest. He'd granted her request, which was more than she'd dared hope. But the coldness of that final command cut deep. She'd saved a young man from hanging or transportation, and her husband's only response was a curt dismissal. She took the letter to Mrs. Collins personally, watching the woman's face transform from fear to overwhelming gratitude. "He's free?" Mrs. Collins gasped. "Truly free?" "The Duke has withdrawn all charges." Eliza managed a smile despite the ache in her chest. "Peter is safe." The news spread through Thornfield like wildfire. By evening, villagers who'd previously kept their distance began arriving at Eliza's cottage with small gifts: a wheel of cheese, fresh bread, a basket of early spring vegetables. Their thanks were awkward but genuine, and Eliza felt something shift in how they looked at her. She was no longer just the Duke's cast-off wife. She was someone who'd fought for one of them and won. But the victory came with a cost Eliza hadn't anticipated. Word of her intervention and the Duke's response reached beyond Thornfield. Within a week, she began receiving visits from people in neighboring villages, all with problems they hoped the Duchess might solve. A tenant farmer whose rent had been raised beyond his means. A widow whose late husband's pension had been cut off. A young woman dismissed from service at the manor without references. They came to Eliza as if she had power she absolutely didn't possess. "I can't help all of you," she told them, her voice breaking with frustration after the fifth such visit in as many days. "I have no influence with the Duke. The poaching case was a single exception." "But you got him to listen once," said the tenant farmer, a grizzled man named Whitmore. "That's more than any of us could do. The Duke doesn't see people like us. But he saw you." "He didn't see me. He read my letter and made a decision. That's not the same thing?" "It's still more than nothing, Your Grace." They left eventually, disappointed but not quite hopeless, and Eliza felt the weight of their expectations crushing down on her. She'd opened a door she didn't know how to close. These people had so little, and they were looking to her, a woman with no real power, no access to her husband, nothing but a cottage and a title she couldn't use, for salvation. That night, Sarah found Eliza sitting in the dark, the fire burned down to coals. "You can't save everyone," Sarah said gently, lighting a candle. "You'll destroy yourself trying." "I know that, but how do I turn them away? How do I look at people who are suffering and say, I won't help just because it's inconvenient or frightening?" "You can't fix a broken system on your own, Eliza." But Sarah used her first name, a familiarity they'd developed over months of friendship. "The Duke controls these lands and everyone on them. Until he changes, nothing you do will matter in the long term. Then I'll help in the short term. I'll write letters, I'll advocate, I'll do whatever small things I can." Eliza's voice hardened with determination. "I won't be useless just because I'm powerless." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "You're going to make him notice you, one way or another." "I don't want him to notice me. I want him to notice them, the people he's supposed to protect." She began writing letters, carefully worded, respectful requests on behalf of tenants who couldn't advocate for themselves. She didn't send one every day. She wasn't foolish enough to overwhelm Rowan with demands, but she sent them regularly enough that he couldn't ignore the pattern. Most went unanswered. A few received terse responses denying her requests. But occasionally, very occasionally, he granted what she asked for. A rent reduction here, a pension restored there. Small victories that meant everything to the people involved. And each small victory bound Eliza more tightly to the village. The people of Thornfield began to see her not as an exile or a scandal, but as one of them, someone who fought battles they couldn't fight themselves. But not everyone approved. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," Mrs. Blackwood declared one Sunday after church services. She was the wealthiest woman in Thornfield, her husband a successful merchant who'd purchased property in the area. "Inserting yourself into matters that are none of your concern. It's unseemly." "Helping people is unseemly?" Eliza asked quietly. "Helping them rise above their station is." These people need to accept their lot in life, not go running to the Duke's wife every time things get difficult. Mrs. Blackwood sniffed. And you, Your Grace, should remember your own position. You're here because the Duke sent you away. Acting like some sort of village advocate won't change that fact. The words stung because they were partially true. Eliza was here because Rowan had exiled her. Every letter she sent was a reminder of her powerlessness, her dependence on his whims, but she kept sending them anyway. Spring arrived properly in April, bringing warmth and renewal to the countryside. Eliza's garden, which she'd planted with Sarah's help, began to show signs of life. The children in her school were reading simple books now, their progress a source of pride that surprised her with its intensity. She was hanging laundry one morning when a carriage appeared on the road, not the rough farm cart that occasionally brought supplies, but an elegant coach with the Ashcroft crest on the door. Eliza's heart stopped. Was Rowan coming to see her? After months of silence, had something finally prompted him to visit? But the figure that emerged from the carriage wasn't Rowan. It was Mrs. Pemberton. The housekeeper approached with her usual brisk efficiency, though Eliza noticed she looked older than she had at the wedding. The months had worn on everyone, it seemed. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton curtsied properly, something that felt absurd given the laundry basket at Eliza's feet and the mud on her simple dress. "Mrs. Pemberton, this is unexpected." Eliza gestured toward the cottage. "Please, come inside." Over tea that Eliza prepared herself, a skill that would have horrified her months ago, Mrs. Pemberton delivered her message. "The Duke has asked me to inquire about your welfare and to ensure you have adequate supplies for the coming months." How considerate of him to send someone to check on the wife he exiled. Eliza heard the bitterness in her own voice and winced. "I apologize. That was unkind. I'm managing well enough, thank you." Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened. "He's also asked that you cease writing to him about tenant matters." There it was. Eliza set down her teacup carefully to hide the trembling in her hands. "I see. He says it's inappropriate for you to involve yourself in estate business, that you're overstepping the boundaries of your position." "My position?" Eliza laughed without humor. "What exactly is my position, Mrs. Pemberton? I'm his wife, but I'm forbidden from living with him. I'm a duchess, but I'm exiled to a cottage. I have his name, but none of his trust. So please, enlighten me. What are the boundaries of such a position?" "I don't know, Your Grace." Mrs. Pemberton looked genuinely troubled. "But I do know that your letters have been noticed. The Duke reads each one. He doesn't always act on them, but he reads them." That small piece of information shouldn't have meant anything, but it kindled something in Eliza's chest. He read them. He knew what she was doing, what she cared about. "Tell him I'll stop writing when people stop needing help," Eliza said quietly. "Tell him that if he wishes me to remain silent, he should try treating his tenants with basic human decency, so they don't need to come to me." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened. "Your Grace, I can't tell the Duke." "Then don't tell him. But I won't stop. These people have no one else to speak for them." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Eliza sat in her cottage and wondered if she'd just made a terrible mistake. Defying Rowan's direct order seemed unwise at best, suicidal at worst. He could cut off her allowance, evict her from the cottage, make her life even more unbearable than it already was. But she meant what she'd said. She wouldn't stop. That decision would have consequences she couldn't predict. But for the first time since her exile began, Eliza felt like she was choosing her own path rather than simply enduring the one chosen for her. She was done being passive, done accepting, done waiting for mercy that would never come. If Rowan Ashcroft wanted a quiet, obedient wife hidden away where she wouldn't embarrass him, he'd married the wrong woman. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. In his study at Ashcroft Manor, Rowan listened to Mrs. Pemberton's report with growing irritation that he refused to name as anything else. "She refused?" he asked quietly. "She said she won't stop writing until people stop needing help, Your Grace." Rowan's jaw clenched. He'd been receiving Eliza's letters for weeks now, each one a needle of guilt he couldn't extract. Her requests were always reasonable, her tone always respectful, but their very existence accused him of failure. Failure to care for his tenants properly. Failure to notice suffering that apparently his exiled wife could see from her cottage, but he couldn't from his manor. He'd granted some of her requests to silence her, to prove he was magnanimous. Instead, it had encouraged more letters, more requests, more evidence that perhaps he wasn't the benevolent landlord he'd always believed himself to be. And now she'd defied him directly. "She's become quite involved in village life, I understand," Mrs. Pemberton continued, her tone carefully neutral. "She teaches the children, helps the sick. The people there speak of her with great respect." "How commendable," Rowan said coldly. "My exiled duchess has found purpose playing at being a village saint." "I don't think she's playing, Your Grace." Rowan looked up sharply. Mrs. Pemberton held his gaze, something she rarely dared to do. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nothing, Your Grace. Simply observing that the Duchess seems genuinely committed to helping the people of Thornfield, and that they, in turn, have come to rely on her." After she left, Rowan sat alone with his thoughts and his wife's latest letter. It requested leniency for a tenant who'd fallen behind on rent due to illness. A simple enough matter. He could grant it with a word, but that would mean acknowledging her letters, acknowledging that she was right to send them, acknowledging that perhaps he'd been wrong about more than just this. He stood abruptly and went to the window, looking out over his vast estate. Somewhere out there, in a cottage on the edge of his lands, the woman he'd married and exiled was living a life he couldn't fathom, helping people, teaching children, writing letters that haunted him, being the kind of person he'd once hoped to be before bitterness had frozen his heart solid. Rowan realized with dawning horror that he'd stopped thinking about Eliza as the scheming fortune hunter he'd convinced himself she was. The letters had done that, worn away his certainty with their consistent compassion and stubborn advocacy. He didn't know who his wife truly was, but he was beginning to suspect she wasn't the villain he'd needed her to be. And that thought terrified him more than her defiance ever could. The thought kept him awake that night and the night after. By the third sleepless dawn, Rowan made a decision that would have seemed impossible months earlier. He would go to Thornfield himself. Not to confront Eliza, he told himself it wasn't about her at all, but to see these tenants she kept writing about, to assess whether her concerns had merit or if she was simply meddling where she didn't belong. He would go in disguise. A wealthy landowner inspecting his own estate would only see what people wanted him to see, bowing heads and careful words. But a stranger passing through might witness the truth. On a gray morning in late April, Rowan dressed in the worn clothes of a traveling merchant and rode out alone, leaving word with Mrs. Pemberton that he'd be inspecting the northern properties for several days. He took a less distinctive horse from the stables and deliberately roughened his appearance, letting stubble grow on his jaw and pulling a cap low over his eyes. The ride to Thornfield took most of the day. He approached the village from the east, dismounting before he crested the final hill to walk his horse down the main road. What he saw stopped him cold. The village was smaller than he'd remembered from the maps in his study. Perhaps 24 cottages clustered around a rutted square, a church with a crooked steeple, one sad excuse for an inn. The building showed signs of age and neglect. Thatched roofs needed repair. Windows were patched with oiled paper instead of glass. The whole place had the worn-down look of poverty that had settled in and made itself comfortable. This was his land. These were his tenants, and he'd never actually seen any of it with his own eyes. Rowan tethered his horse outside the inn and went inside. The common room was dim and smoky, populated by a handful of men nursing ale after a day's work. They glanced at him with the wary curiosity villagers reserved for strangers, then returned to their conversations. He ordered a pint and found a corner table, listening. "Heard the Duchess got old man Whitmore's rent reduced," one man was saying. "Wrote to the Duke herself, she did." "Fat lot of good that'll do when next quarter comes round," another replied. "The Duke don't care about the likes of us. He'll just raise it again." "You don't know that. Her Grace has been helping more folk than just Whitmore." "Her Grace is stuck in that cottage same as we're stuck in ours, just with fancier furnishings. Woman's got no real power." Rowan's fingers tightened on his mug. He wanted to interrupt, to defend himself, but that would defeat the purpose of the disguise. Instead, he drank and listened as the conversation shifted to crops and weather and the usual concerns of farming folk. Later, as the sun set and the inn began to empty, the innkeeper approached his table. "You looking for work, stranger, or just passing through?" Just passing through, Rowan replied, keeping his accent rough and his words clipped. Heard there was a duchess living out here, though. Seems an odd thing. The innkeeper's expression shifted, becoming guarded. Best not to gossip about the nobility, friend. Causes trouble. No gossip intended. Just curious why a duke's wife would be living in a village like this instead of some grand manor. The innkeeper studied him for a long moment, then seemed to decide Rowan was harmless enough. Nobody knows for certain. Some say she was ill. Others say there was scandal. But she's been good to us. I'll say that much. Teaches the children, helps where she can. More than we've seen from the Duke himself in all my years. The words landed like a physical blow. Rowan managed to nod and order another ale to cover his reaction. That night, he took a room in the inn, a cramped space that smelled of mildew and old smoke, and lay awake thinking about what he'd heard. The casual way the villagers had dismissed him as uncaring, the genuine affection in their voices when they spoke of Eliza. He told himself he was a good landlord, that his estate was well managed. He collected reasonable rents, didn't he? He'd never evicted anyone without cause. He'd considered that sufficient. But he'd also never visited these villages himself, never seen the conditions his tenants lived in, never asked if reasonable rents were reasonable when the roofs were leaking and the crops were failing. Morning came too early. Rowan rose with the sun and ventured into the village proper, keeping his cap pulled low and his posture humble. People were already moving about their business, women heading to wells with buckets, men walking toward fields with tools over their shoulders, children running errands. And then he saw her. Eliza emerged from a cottage near the edge of the square, a basket over her arm. She wore a simple gray dress that he recognized as one of her older gowns, altered and mended to be more practical. Her hair was pinned up simply, and her face was different. Thinner, yes, but also more alive than he'd ever seen it. During their brief courtship and disastrous wedding, she'd been pale and nervous, like a rabbit waiting for the hawk to strike. Now there was color in her cheeks from the morning air, and her eyes were clear and focused. She looked like someone who'd found her purpose. Rowan pressed himself into the shadow of a building as she walked across the square. She stopped to speak with an elderly woman struggling with a bucket, immediately taking it from her and carrying it to the woman's door. She laughed at something the woman said, a sound Rowan had never heard from her before. Then she continued on, and Rowan followed at a distance, staying back far enough not to be noticed, but close enough to observe. She went to the cottage he recognized from Mrs. Pemberton's description, a small stone building with a garden plot beside it. But she didn't go inside. Instead, children began arriving. First a few, then more, until a dozen or so youngsters of various ages clustered around the door. Eliza greeted each one by name, asked questions that suggested genuine interest in their lives, then ushered them all inside. Rowan moved closer, positioning himself near a window where he could hear without being seen. Today we're going to read about ancient Rome. Eliza's voice drifted through the glass. Who can remember what we learned about Julius Caesar last week? A chorus of young voices responded, eager and excited. Rowan listened as his wife, a woman he'd condemned as a scheming fortune hunter, patiently taught village children their letters and history and arithmetic. She made learning sound like an adventure. She praised effort and gently corrected mistakes, and somehow made a cramped cottage feel like a place of possibility. He stayed there for over an hour, listening. At one point, a small girl struggled with a passage and began to cry in frustration. "Hey now," Eliza said gently. "Learning to read is hard. Your brain is doing something it's never done before, building new paths for the words to travel. Of course it's difficult, but you're doing it. Every day you get a little bit better." "But Jenny can read faster than me," the girl sobbed. "Jenny is 2 years older than you and has been practicing longer. You're not competing with Jenny. You're competing with who you were yesterday. And I promise you, you're already better than yesterday's version of yourself." The simple kindness in those words, the patience and understanding, struck Rowan harder than any of her letters had. This wasn't performance. No one knew he was watching. Eliza had no reason to put on an act for village children in a forgotten corner of his estate. This was who she was. The realization was devastating. After the lesson ended and the children scattered home, Rowan watched Eliza emerge from the cottage looking exhausted but satisfied. She walked to her garden and began pulling weeds with methodical determination, Her fine hands, hands that should have been planning menus and arranging flowers, dirty with honest soil. He should leave. He'd seen enough to know that his assumptions about her had been catastrophically wrong. But he couldn't seem to make himself move. He stood in the shadows and watched his wife tend her small garden and felt the foundations of his certainty crumbling. "You've been standing there a long time, stranger." Rowan whirled to find an older woman watching him with sharp, suspicious eyes. She held a walking stick like a weapon. "Just admiring the garden," he said quickly, keeping his voice rough. "The garden or the gardener?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "Because if you're thinking of causing trouble for Her Grace, you'll have to go through me and half this village first." "No trouble intended." Rowan raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just passing through." "Then pass through somewhere else. The Duchess has had enough men causing her grief without strangers lurking about." The woman didn't leave until Rowan had mounted his horse and ridden out of sight. He circled back through the woods and found another vantage point, unable to help himself. He needed to understand, needed to see more of this woman who wore his name but remained a complete mystery to him. Over the next 2 days, Rowan watched from the shadows as Eliza lived her exile. He saw her help Sarah Miller prepare food for a sick neighbor. He watched her sit with an elderly man who seemed to have no family, reading to him from books she'd carried from her cottage. He observed her mending clothes by candlelight long after dark, her fingers working with the careful precision of someone who'd learned these skills out of necessity rather than leisure. And everywhere she went, people spoke to her with genuine warmth. Not the false deference servants showed nobility, but real affection born of shared struggle and mutual respect. On the third day, Rowan witnessed something that would change everything. He was watching from the woods near Eliza's cottage when he saw 2 well-dressed men arrive on horseback. He recognized one of them immediately, Richard Sterling, the magistrate who'd handled the poaching case. The other was unfamiliar, but carried himself with the arrogant bearing of someone used to authority. Rowan moved closer, staying concealed behind trees, as the men dismounted and knocked on Eliza's door. She opened it, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Gentlemen," she said carefully, "how may I help you?" "Your Grace." Sterling's bow was perfunctory and carried a hint of mockery. "This is Mr. Lawrence Bennett, representative of the Crown's Revenue Office. He has some questions regarding your activities in this village." "My activities?" Eliza's voice remained steady, but Rowan saw her hands tighten on the doorframe. "I teach children and help my neighbors. What questions could the Crown possibly have about that?" Bennett stepped forward, pulling a document from his coat. "We've received reports that you've been accepting payments and gifts in exchange for your advocacy with the Duke of Ashcroft. That you've been, in essence, selling access to your husband's ear for personal profit." The color drained from Eliza's face. "That's absurd. I've never asked for or accepted payment from anyone." "That's not what our information suggests." Bennett's smile was cold. "Multiple witnesses report seeing villagers deliver goods to your cottage. Cheese, bread, vegetables. All after you wrote letters on their behalf to the Duke. Those were gifts of gratitude, not payments. These people have almost nothing, and they wanted to thank me for trying to help them. I can't control what they choose to leave at my door." "The law doesn't distinguish between gifts and payments when it comes to corruption, Your Grace." Sterling's tone was almost gleeful. "You've been using your position as the Duke's wife to extract tribute from his own tenants." "I've done no such thing." Eliza's voice rose, anger finally breaking through her composure. "How dare you accuse me of exploiting people I've been trying to protect?" "Your intentions are irrelevant," Bennett said. "The fact is that you've been accepting valuable goods in connection with your efforts to influence the Duke's decisions regarding his estate. That constitutes corruption under the Crown statutes regarding nobility and their official capacities." Rowan felt cold rage building in his chest. This was absurd, a grotesque twisting of Eliza's generosity into something sinister. But he forced himself to stay hidden, to hear how this would play out. "What do you want?" Eliza asked quietly, and Rowan heard the defeat creeping into her voice. "We want you to cease your interference in estate business immediately," Sterling said. "No more letters to the Duke. No more advocacy on behalf of tenants, and you will return all gifts received over the past 3 months." "Return them? To whom? The people who gave them to me as thanks?" to the crown as forfeited proceeds of corruption. This is madness, Eliza's voice shook. Those gifts amount to perhaps £10 worth of goods over months. You're talking about it as if I've been running some elaborate scheme. The amount is irrelevant, Bennett interrupted. The principle is what matters. You will comply with these demands, or we will be forced to pursue formal charges. And if I refuse? Sterling smiled, and it was a cruel expression. Then you'll be arrested, tried, and almost certainly convicted. The scandal would destroy what little remains of your reputation and embarrass the Duke of Ashcroft considerably. I suspect he would not thank you for that. The threat hung in the air. Rowan watched Eliza's shoulders sag slightly, saw the fight draining out of her. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until tomorrow evening, Bennett replied. We'll return for your answer then. After they left, Eliza stood in her doorway for a long moment before slowly closing the door. Through the window, Rowan saw her sink into a chair and put her head in her hands. He should reveal himself. Should tell her this was nonsense, that he would protect her from these accusations. But doubt held him frozen. What if there was truth to it? What if she had been profiting somehow, and he was simply too infatuated with this new image of her to see it clearly? No. Even as the thought formed, he rejected it. He'd watched her for days now. He'd seen her generosity, her genuine care for these people. This accusation was false, and the men making it had ulterior motives. But what were those motives? Why would a magistrate and a crown officer conspire to silence his wife? Rowan spent the rest of the day investigating. He returned to the inn and carefully steered conversations toward Sterling and Bennett. What he learned made his blood run cold. Sterling had recently purchased land adjacent to Ashcroft Holdings, land he wanted to expand, but Rowan's tenants held leases that prevented easy acquisition. If those tenants were evicted or forced out through economic pressure, the land would revert to Rowan's control, and he could choose to sell it. And Eliza had been writing letters asking for rent reductions and lease extensions for those very tenants. Bennett, meanwhile, had a reputation for investigating minor infractions among the lower nobility, always targeting those who'd fallen from favor or lacked powerful connections. He collected fees for his services and was rumored to accept bribes to drop investigations. They were trying to silence Eliza because her advocacy was interfering with Sterling's land grab, and they were counting on her isolation, on the fact that her own husband had exiled her, to make her vulnerable to their threats. Rowan felt fury building like a storm. These men were using his own actions against his wife. His exile of Eliza had marked her as powerless, someone who could be threatened without consequence. He'd done this to her. He'd made her vulnerable to exactly this kind of predation. That night, Rowan barely slept. He paced the tiny inn room, wrestling with what to do. He could reveal himself, confront Sterling and Bennett directly, but that would raise questions about why the Duke of Ashcroft had been lurking around Thornfield in disguise. More importantly, it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. Even if he drove these particular vultures away, others would come. As long as Eliza remained exiled, isolated, separated from him and his protection, she would be seen as weak. A target. He'd made her a target by casting her out. The realization was crushing. Everything that had happened, the poaching case, the flood of villagers seeking her help, and now this accusation, all of it stemmed from his decision to exile her. He'd created the circumstances that forced her to become an advocate, and now that advocacy was being used as a weapon against her. Dawn found him dressed in his own clothes again, the disguise abandoned. He couldn't hide anymore. Couldn't watch from the shadows while his wife fought battles he should have been fighting for her. He rode directly to Eliza's cottage and knocked on the door. When she opened it, still in her nightclothes with her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression cycled through shock, fear, and finally resigned exhaustion. "Your Grace," she said flatly. "I wasn't expecting you." "May I come in?" She stepped aside wordlessly. The cottage was even smaller than it had appeared from outside. One room serving as kitchen and living space, a bedroom visible through an open door, everything clean but shabby. This was where he'd sent his wife to live. This tiny, cold space while he dwelt in a manor with 40 rooms. "I heard about the accusations," he said without preamble. Eliza's eyes widened. "How?" "They only came yesterday, and I've told no one. I was here, in the village. I've been watching for 3 days." He saw her face flush with anger and held up a hand. I came in disguise to see if your letters had merit, to understand what you were doing here. Spying on me. Her voice was cold. How very like you. I know you're angry. Angry? She laughed bitterly. I'm beyond anger, Rowan. I'm exhausted. You exile me to this cottage, ignore my existence for months, finally acknowledge me only to order me to stop helping people, and now you appear to tell me you've been spying on me? What possible response could I have besides anger? The accusations are false, he said, ignoring her outburst. Sterling wants your tenants gone so he can buy their land. He's using this corruption charge to silence you. My tenants? Eliza's voice rose. They're not my tenants. They're yours. I have nothing. No land, no power, no protection. I'm just the inconvenient wife you stuck in a cottage and tried to forget. You're right. The admission came harder than anything he'd ever said. You're absolutely right. I was wrong to exile you, wrong to believe the worst of you, wrong about everything. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Is this supposed to fix things? One admission of wrongdoing after months of cruelty? No, but it's the truth, and you deserve at least that. Rowan took a breath. I'm going to handle Sterling and Bennett. They won't trouble you again. And then what? You'll ride back to your manor and I'll stay here and nothing will actually change? What do you want to change? The question hung between them. Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and he saw years of pain and loneliness in her eyes. I want you to see me, she said finally, her voice breaking. Not as a fortune hunter or a burden or a mistake. Just as a person who's trying her best in an impossible situation. But I don't think you're capable of that. Before Rowan could respond, shouts erupted outside. They both turned toward the window to see smoke rising from the direction of the village square. Fire, someone was screaming. The church is burning. Eliza ran for the door without hesitation, grabbing a shawl as she went. Rowan followed, his heart pounding. The church was old, wooden, and would burn like kindling. The village square was chaos. Flames engulfed the church's thatched roof, and villagers formed desperate bucket brigades from the well, their efforts pathetically inadequate against the conflagration. Children were crying, adults shouting, and through it all the fire roared like a living thing. The children's books, Eliza gasped. I stored all the school materials in the vestry. She started running toward the burning building. Eliza, no! Rowan lunged after her, catching her arm. It's too dangerous. Those books are all we have. The children need them. She tried to pull free, but he held tight. Books can be replaced. You can't. A crash from inside the church punctuated his words as part of the roof collapsed. Sparks flew up into the morning sky, and the flames burned hotter. Then a woman screamed, Matthew! Where's Matthew? Rowan recognized her, the woman who'd confronted him when he'd been watching Eliza's cottage. He was in the church earlier, she wailed. He liked to sit in there sometimes. He's still inside. Everything stopped. The old man who Rowan had seen Eliza reading to, the one with no family. He was inside that inferno. Eliza tore free from Rowan's grip and ran. Eliza! Rowan's shout was lost in the roar of flames as she disappeared into the burning church. Rowan didn't think. He ran after her, plunging through the church door into a nightmare of heat and smoke. The interior was an inferno, flames consuming the wooden pews, the roof beams groaning ominously overhead. Smoke choked the air so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. Eliza! His shout came out as a ragged cough. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, squinting through the hellish orange glow. He spotted her near the altar, bent over a crumpled form. Matthew lay unconscious, overcome by smoke. Eliza was trying to drag him toward the door, but the old man was dead weight, and she wasn't strong enough. Rowan reached them in seconds, shoving Eliza aside and hauling Matthew over his shoulder. Go, now! They ran. Behind them, another section of roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a wave of heat and sparks after them. Rowan's lungs screamed for clean air. His eyes watered from the smoke. He stumbled on debris but kept moving, kept pushing forward. They burst through the door just as the main roof beam gave way. The entire structure collapsed inward with a roar that sounded like the earth splitting open. Rowan and Eliza tumbled down the church steps. Matthew landing heavily beside them as villagers rushed forward to help. Rowan rolled onto his back, gasping, his lungs burning with each breath. Beside him, Eliza was coughing violently, her face blackened with soot, her eyes streaming, but she was alive. They were all alive. Matthew! The elderly woman who'd called out earlier fell to her knees beside the unconscious man. Is he breathing? Sarah Miller pushed through the crowd and pressed her ear to Matthew's chest. Yes, but barely. We need to get him somewhere he can rest. Tom, help me carry him to my house. Two men lifted Matthew gently and carried him away. The elderly woman followed, throwing a grateful look back at Eliza and Rowan. The crowd stood in stunned silence, watching the church burn to its foundation. There was nothing to save now. The bucket brigade had given up, focusing instead on wetting down the nearby buildings to prevent the fire from spreading. Slowly, people began to notice the two soot-covered figures sitting in the dirt. Recognition rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. That's Her Grace, someone whispered. And him. That's the Duke. That's actually the Duke of Ashcroft. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Rowan struggled to his feet, helping Eliza up beside him. She swayed slightly, and he kept his hand on her arm to steady her. Your Grace. The village blacksmith, a burly man named Anderson, stepped forward. You saved Matthew's life, both of you. We did what anyone would do, Eliza said hoarsely, her voice wrecked from smoke. No. Anderson shook his head. Most folk wouldn't have run into a burning building for an old man with no family and nothing to give in return. But you did. You always do. Other voices joined in, a chorus of gratitude and wonder. These people had known Eliza for months, had accepted her help and her teaching, but they were seeing her differently now. Not as the exiled duchess playing at charity, but as someone who would risk her life for one of them. And they were seeing Rowan too, really seeing him for the first time. Not the distant lord in his manor, but a man who'd followed his wife into fire without hesitation. How did it start? Rowan asked, his voice rough. The fire. Don't know, Your Grace, Anderson replied. Tom Fletcher saw smoke coming from the roof round dawn. By the time we got organized, it was too far gone to stop. Something about that didn't sit right with Rowan. Church fires weren't common, and the timing, just hours before Sterling and Bennett were supposed to return for Eliza's answer, seemed too convenient. But before he could pursue that thought, Eliza swayed again, this time more dramatically. Rowan caught her as her knees buckled. She needs to rest, Sarah said firmly, materializing beside them. And you too, Your Grace. You've both breathed enough smoke to fell a horse. Come on, let's get you both back to the cottage. The crowd parted as Sarah led them away, with half the village following at a respectful distance. By the time they reached Eliza's cottage, a small mob had gathered, people bringing water, clean cloths, herbal remedies for smoke inhalation. Sarah took charge with the practiced efficiency of someone used to crisis. She settled Eliza in a chair, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and pressed a cup of water into her hands. Rowan received the same treatment, though he tried to protest. Drink, Sarah ordered, brooking no argument. Both of you. They drank. The water soothed Rowan's ravaged throat only marginally. Across from him, Eliza looked like she might collapse at any moment. Her hands shook as she held the cup, and her breathing came in labored gasps. Everyone out, Sarah announced to the crowd still hovering in the doorway. Give them space to recover. But we wanted to thank... You can thank them later. Out. Now. The villagers reluctantly dispersed, leaving Sarah alone with Rowan and Eliza. She busied herself making tea and finding clean clothes for both of them, a shirt of Matthew's that she'd been mending for Rowan, and a fresh dress for Eliza. Change out of those smoke-ruined things, she said. I'll step outside. After she left, an awkward silence filled the small cottage. Rowan turned his back to give Eliza privacy as they changed, acutely aware that this was more intimacy than they'd shared since their wedding night. Thank you, Eliza said quietly, for following me in there, for helping with Matthew. You shouldn't have run in at all, Rowan replied, pulling on the borrowed shirt. You could have died. So could you. He turned to find her dressed in the clean gown, her hair still wild and her face still smudged with soot. She looked exhausted and beautiful and absolutely furious. Why are you here, Rowan? She demanded. The real reason, not this nonsense about investigating my letters. I told you. You told me what you wanted me to believe. But spying on me for 3 days, that's not normal concern about estate management. That's something else. She was right, and he owed her honesty. I couldn't stop thinking about your letters, about the things you were asking for, the people you were trying to help. It made me question whether I knew anything about my own estate, about my own wife. And what did you learn in your 3 days of surveillance? That I've been a fool. The words came out harsher than he intended. That I judged you without evidence, condemned you without trial, and exiled someone who might be the best person I've ever known. Eliza stared at him, her expression unreadable. You think 3 days of watching me teach children and pull weeds erases what you did? You cast me out on our wedding night, Rowan. You looked at me with contempt and sent me away like I was nothing. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I know. You don't know. Her voice broke, tears finally spilling over. You don't know what it was like to be utterly alone in this cottage, to have everyone in England whispering about what I must have done to deserve exile. You don't know what it was like to teach myself to cook and clean and survive because you sent me here with nothing. You don't know what it felt like to realize that my own husband hated me so much he couldn't bear to be in the same house. Each word was a dagger, and Rowan took them all without defense. You're right. I don't know. But I want to understand. He stopped, unsure what he wanted. Everything he'd believed for months had crumbled. He was standing in the ruins of his own certainty, and he had no idea how to rebuild. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah poked her head in, her expression grim. The magistrate is back. He's got Bennett with him and about 6 men who look like trouble. They're asking for her grace. Rowan felt cold fury settle in his gut. Tell them the Duchess is recovering from smoke inhalation and will receive no visitors today. I don't think they'll accept that, Your Grace. Then I'll make them accept it. He strode to the door and yanked it open. Sterling and Bennett stood in the cottage garden, flanked by 6 rough-looking men who were definitely not crown officials. Hired muscle, Rowan realized. They'd come prepared to intimidate, or worse. Your Grace! Sterling's surprise at seeing Rowan was evident, but quickly masked. We weren't expecting you. Clearly, Rowan stepped outside, positioning himself between the men and the cottage door. State your business and leave. My wife has just survived a fire and needs rest. We heard about the unfortunate incident with the church, Bennett said smoothly. Most tragic. But we're here on crown business that can't wait. We need to speak with the Duchess about the corruption charges. There are no corruption charges because there was no corruption. Rowan kept his voice level, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. My wife accepted gifts of gratitude from people she'd helped. That's not a crime. The law disagrees. The law says nothing of the sort, and you know it. Rowan took a step forward, and the hired men shifted nervously. This isn't about corruption. This is about you, Sterling, wanting to acquire tenant land that my wife's advocacy has protected. You're using false charges to silence her so you can proceed with your land grab. Sterling's face flushed. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. I've spent the last 3 days investigating. I know about your recent purchases. I know which tenants you're targeting, and I know that every single one of them is someone my wife has written to me about. Rowan smiled without humor. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw these ridiculous charges immediately. You're going to leave my wife alone, and you're going to abandon any plans to acquire land from my tenants. And if we refuse, Bennett asked, then I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you both. I'll have the real Crown investigators look into your activities, Bennett. I suspect they'll find a pattern of extortion and bribery that will see you in prison. As for you, Sterling, I'll make certain that every land deal you've made in the past 5 years is scrutinized for irregularities. Given your reputation, I imagine they'll find plenty. The 2 men exchanged glances. The hired muscle looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly not paid enough to face down an angry duke. You're making a mistake protecting her, Sterling said finally. Everyone knows you sent her away in disgrace. Defending her now will only raise questions. Let them question. Rowan's voice was cold steel. My wife ran into a burning building to save a man's life this morning. What have you done today besides threaten a woman who's shown more courage and compassion than either of you could comprehend?" A crowd had gathered again, drawn by the confrontation. Rowan saw villagers he recognized from his days of watching: Anderson the blacksmith, Sarah Miller, the Whitmore family, Peter Collins, and his mother. They stood silent, witnessing everything. "We won't forget this interference," Bennett said quietly. "Neither will I." Rowan stepped even closer, lowering his voice so only Sterling and Bennett could hear. "If either of you comes near my wife again, if you so much as speak her name, I will end you. That's not a threat. It's a promise. Now get off my land." They left, the hired men practically running to keep up. The crowd watched them go, then slowly turned their attention back to Rowan. He suddenly became aware that he was standing in front of his wife's cottage, having just publicly defended the woman he'd exiled months ago. The contradiction was glaring and impossible to ignore. Anderson stepped forward, his expression cautious. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I don't understand. If you care about her grace enough to threaten the magistrate, why is she living in this cottage instead of at the manor with you?" The question hung in the air. Every eye was on Rowan, waiting for an answer he didn't have. Or rather, an answer he had but couldn't bear to speak aloud. That he'd been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and his pride had nearly cost him everything. The cottage door opened behind him. Eliza stepped out, still wrapped in her blanket, her face pale but determined. "I'll answer that," she said quietly. "The Duke sent me here because he believed I married him for his money. He thought I was part of a scheme by my father to trap him into clearing our family debts." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rowan wanted to stop her, to prevent her from exposing their private shame, but he'd forfeited that right months ago. "He was wrong," Eliza continued, her voice growing stronger. "My father's debts existed, yes, but they came from generosity, not greed. And I agreed to the marriage not to trap anyone, but to help my family while hoping that perhaps affection might grow between us." She looked directly at Rowan. "I was naive enough to believe in the possibility of love." "Your Grace, you don't have to," Sarah started, but Eliza held up a hand. "I do have to. These people deserve to know the truth. They've been kind to me when kindness was the last thing I expected. They've made me feel less alone." She turned back to the crowd. "The Duke made a mistake based on fear and past hurt. And I survived it. I learned to live without the life I thought I'd have. I found purpose here, with all of you." "Then why is he here now?" someone called out. "Because he realized he was wrong," Eliza said simply. "Whether that realization comes too late is something we're still determining." She met Rowan's eyes, and he saw the challenge there. Words weren't enough. Apologies weren't enough. She was asking him to choose, right here in front of everyone, who he was going to be, the man who'd cast her out, or someone capable of growth. Rowan took a breath and addressed the crowd. "Everything my wife said is true. I wronged her terribly. I sent her away based on assumptions and fear rather than facts or trust. I convinced myself I was protecting myself from deception when really I was just running from the possibility of being hurt." He paused, the next word sticking in his throat. "I watched her for 3 days before revealing myself. I saw her teach your children, help your sick, advocate for those who had no voice. I saw a woman of extraordinary character and kindness, and I realized that I'd thrown away something precious because I was too much of a coward to believe in it." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "I can't undo what I did," Rowan continued. "I can't give back the months she spent alone in this cottage, fighting battles she should never have had to fight. But I can acknowledge my mistakes publicly as I made them, and I can promise that from this moment forward, things will be different." "How different?" Anderson asked, his arms crossed. "You going to take her back to the manor? Or is she still exiled?" It was the question Rowan had been avoiding. Taking Eliza back meant admitting his failure to everyone, not just this village, but all of society. It meant facing the gossip and the speculation and the judgment. It meant being vulnerable in ways he'd spent his whole life avoiding. He looked at Eliza, standing there exhausted and beautiful and brave, and realized that his fear of judgment meant nothing compared to the reality of losing her. "She was never truly exiled," he said. "She's the Duchess of Ashcroft, and she belongs at Ashcroft Manor. I'm hoping she'll agree to return home with me." More gasps. Eliza's eyes widened, and he saw surprise there. Genuine surprise that he would say it, would commit to it in front of witnesses who would spread the word far and wide. "Just like that?" she asked quietly. "You exile me for months, and now you want me to just come back?" "No, not just like that." Rowan moved closer, aware that dozens of people were watching but unable to care. "I want to earn the right to have you come back. I want to prove that I've changed, that I can be the husband you deserve from the beginning. I want—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "I want a chance to start over, to court you properly, to build the trust I destroyed, to see if perhaps that affection you hoped for might still be possible. You're asking me to trust you again." Eliza's voice was soft, but not weak. "After everything. I'm asking you to let me prove I'm worthy of that trust. I'm not asking for forgiveness or immediate reconciliation. I'm asking for the opportunity to show you, through actions rather than words, that I understand what I did wrong and that I'm committed to doing better." Tears slid down Eliza's soot-stained cheeks. "I don't know if I can." "I know, and I don't blame you, but I'm asking anyway because the alternative, walking away and leaving things as they are, is worse than any rejection you could give me." Sarah made a small sound, something between a sob and a laugh. Other villagers were wiping their eyes or looking away, giving the moment what privacy they could, despite the very public nature of it. Eliza wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, her expression troubled. "If I return to the manor, what happens to the children I teach, to the people here who've come to depend on me?" "They don't lose you," Rowan said immediately. "We'll build a proper school in Thornfield, hire additional teachers if needed. You can continue teaching if you wish or supervise the program, whatever you want. And the advocacy you've been doing for tenants, for people who need help, that doesn't stop. In fact, I want you to help me understand what's actually happening on my estate, because clearly I've been blind to problems that you saw immediately." "You'd give me that kind of authority?" she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "You've already been exercising it, just without my official support. I'm simply acknowledging what's already true. You care more about these people and understand their needs better than I do." "Why wouldn't I want your help managing the estate properly?" Anderson cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon again, Your Grace. But Her Grace has been like a light in this village. If she leaves—" "She won't be leaving," Rowan interrupted. "She'll be living at the manor, yes, but Thornfield is part of the Ashcroft estate. She'll still be here, still be involved. And furthermore, I'll be here too, actually paying attention to tenant concerns instead of hiding in my study with ledgers." The blacksmith studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Though I'll say this, if you hurt her again, Your Grace or not, you'll answer to more than just your conscience. I would expect nothing less." The crowd began to disperse, giving them space at last. Sarah squeezed Eliza's hand and whispered something Rowan couldn't hear before slipping away. Soon they were alone in the garden, exhausted and covered in soot, the ruins of the church still smoking in the distance. "I need time," Eliza said finally. I can't pretend these months didn't happen. I can't forget what it felt like to be cast out." "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to let me try to make amends." "How? By taking me back to a house where I was never wanted? By forcing us to live together when you can barely stand the sight of me?" "I can't stand the sight of you?" Rowan stared at her. "Eliza, I've been unable to stop thinking about you for months. Your letters haunted me. The reports of your kindness to villagers made me question everything I believed about myself. I came here in disguise because I was desperate to understand who you really were, and what I found destroyed every assumption I'd built my world on. That's not enough. I know it's not enough." His voice rose, frustration bleeding through. "I know that words mean nothing after what I did, but I'm not just offering words, I'm offering action. I'm offering to stand in that ballroom in London and tell every gossip and scandalmonger that I was wrong about you. I'm offering to defend you publicly the way I should have from the beginning. I'm offering to give you the authority you should have always had as my wife. What more can I offer?" "Time," Eliza repeated, her voice breaking. "Give me time to heal, time to decide if I even want to be your wife anymore, or if this marriage is just a cage I should escape from." The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. It hadn't occurred to him that she might want to end the marriage entirely, that she might be so damaged by what he'd done that reconciliation was impossible. "If that's what you decide," he said slowly. I won't fight you. I'll give you whatever freedom you want, but please, at least give me the chance to prove I've changed before you make that decision. A commotion from the village square interrupted them. Rowan turned to see Peter Collins running toward them, his face flushed with exertion. Your Graces, I mean! He skidded to a stop, panting. You need to come quick. We found something in the church ruins, something you should see. They followed Peter back to the destroyed church, where a small group had gathered around something in the ashes. Anderson looked up as they approached, his expression grim. Careful, the timbers are still hot, but look here. He pointed to a section of floor near where the fire had apparently started. Even charred and destroyed, the evidence was clear. Oil stains on the wood, multiple points of origin, the remnants of what looked like oil-soaked rags. This weren't an accident, Anderson said quietly. Someone set this fire deliberately. Rowan felt ice run through his veins. The timing, the accusations against Eliza, and now arson. This was all connected. Sterling, he breathed. You think the magistrate did this? Peter asked, shocked. I think he wanted to send a message, to frighten the village, to prove how vulnerable you all are without official protection. Rowan clenched his fists. This is my fault. I should have handled him more forcefully. No. Eliza's voice was firm. This is his fault, not yours. He chose to do this. He chose violence and intimidation. But he did it because I threatened him, because he knew I would protect you, and that meant he couldn't. Rowan stopped, seeing the pattern clearly now. He's going to escalate. Men like Sterling don't back down when challenged. They double down. Then we need evidence, Eliza said. Real evidence of what he's done. The arson, the false corruption charges, the land schemes, everything. I'll send investigators. No. If you send official investigators, he'll have time to cover his tracks and prepare defenses. We need something more direct. Eliza's eyes narrowed, and Rowan recognized the expression. She was planning something dangerous. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Sterling expects me to be frightened into silence, that he assumes I'll run to the manor and hide behind you now that you've offered protection. She smiled, and it was not a gentle expression. But what if instead I invited him to return tomorrow to discuss the charges? What if I acted like I was ready to cooperate? Absolutely not. You're not putting yourself in danger. I'm already in danger, Rowan. We all are, as long as Sterling thinks he can get away with this. But if he comes here believing he's won, believing I'm defeated, he might reveal something we can use against him. Or he might hurt you. Not if you're here. Hidden the way you were for 3 days, watching and listening. Eliza met his eyes. You wanted to prove you've changed? Then trust me to handle this. Trust that I'm capable of more than just being protected. Rowan wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed to lock her in the manor where she'd be safe. But he'd promised to give her authority, to respect her judgment. And she was right. Hiding wouldn't solve this. On one condition, he said finally, at the first sign of real danger, I intervene. No arguments. Agreed. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Rowan sent a carefully worded message to Sterling suggesting that the Duchess was reconsidering her position and wished to discuss terms. The response came within hours. Sterling would arrive the following afternoon. That night, Eliza refused Rowan's offer to stay in the cottage to guard her. If someone's watching, they need to see you leave, she said firmly. They need to believe I'm alone and vulnerable. I don't like this. I know, but it's necessary. She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, her expression softened slightly. Thank you. For listening, for trusting my judgment, even when it frightens you. Don't thank me yet. This plan terrifies me. Good. It terrifies me too. But fear means we're doing something that matters. Rowan wanted to kiss her, to pull her close and tell her everything he'd realized over the past days. But he didn't have that right yet. Instead, he simply nodded and left, mounting his horse and riding ostentatiously toward the manor while the sun set behind him. But he didn't go far. 2 miles down the road, he circled back through the woods and found a position near Eliza's cottage where he could watch without being seen. The night was cold, and he wrapped himself in his cloak and settled in for a long vigil. Inside the cottage, candlelight flickered. He could see Eliza's shadow moving about, preparing for bed, living her normal routine. To anyone watching, she was alone and unguarded. But Rowan was there in the darkness, a silent sentinel, and he wouldn't leave until this was finished. Whatever came tomorrow, whatever Sterling tried, he would be ready. He would not fail her again. Dawn broke cold and gray over Thornfield. Rowan had spent the night in the woods, sleeping in brief, fitful intervals while keeping watch over the cottage. His body ached from the uncomfortable position, and frost clung to his cloak, but he didn't move from his post. Through the cottage window, he saw Eliza rise and move about her morning routine with the same calm efficiency she'd shown every day of her exile. The sight of her, alone in that small space, preparing to face danger without flinching, filled him with equal parts admiration and terror. Around mid-morning, Sarah Miller arrived with a basket of bread and stopped at the cottage door. Rowan watched as the two women spoke, though he couldn't hear the words. Sarah looked worried, her gestures animated, but Eliza shook her head firmly, and eventually the older woman left, though she kept glancing back over her shoulder. The hours crawled by. Rowan shifted position to keep his muscles from cramping, all the while maintaining his vigil. He'd sent word to Anderson the previous night to have men positioned around the village, close enough to respond if needed, but far enough not to be obvious. If Sterling brought his hired thugs again, they wouldn't catch the village unprepared. At precisely 2 in the afternoon, Sterling's carriage appeared on the road. Rowan tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol he'd tucked in his belt. The magistrate emerged from the carriage along with Bennett, and as expected, 3 of the rough men from yesterday. But there was someone else, a 4th man Rowan didn't recognize, better dressed than the muscle, carrying a leather satchel like a clerk or solicitor. Rowan frowned. What was Sterling planning? The group approached Eliza's cottage, and Sterling knocked with exaggerated courtesy. After a moment, Eliza opened the door. Even from a distance, Rowan could see the way she held herself, back straight, chin up, every inch a duchess despite the simple dress she wore. "Gentlemen," her voice carried clearly in the still air, "please come in." They filed inside, the cottage suddenly crowded with bodies. Rowan crept closer, moving silently through the trees until he was positioned beneath the window where he'd listened to her teach days before. From here, he could hear everything. "Your Grace," Sterling's voice dripped false warmth. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I trust you've had time to reconsider your position regarding the corruption charges?" "I've had time to think, yes." Eliza's voice was steady, giving nothing away. "Please, sit if you can find space. Would you like tea?" "This isn't a social call, Your Grace." Bennett's tone was colder than Sterling's. "We're here for your decision. Will you cease your interference in estate matters and return the gifts you've improperly received, or must we proceed with formal charges?" A pause. Rowan held his breath. "Before I answer," Eliza said carefully, "I'd like to understand something. The gifts I received, bread, cheese, vegetables from people's gardens, amount to perhaps 10 pounds in total value over several months. Why is the Crown so interested in such trivial matters when there are surely larger corruption cases to pursue?" "The law applies equally to all," Bennett replied smoothly. "Nobility are not exempt from prosecution." "Of course not, but surely prosecutorial discretion means focusing resources on cases that actually matter." "Unless—" Eliza paused, and Rowan could picture her expression, thoughtful, innocent, dangerous. "Unless this isn't really about corruption at all." "What are you suggesting?" Sterling's voice had an edge now. "I'm suggesting that the timing is interesting. These charges appeared just as I was successfully advocating for tenant lease extensions on land adjacent to your recent purchases, Mr. Sterling. Land you've been trying to acquire for development. That's preposterous. Is it? Because I've been doing some investigating of my own. It turns out that every tenant I've written to my husband about, every single person whose lease extension or rent reduction I've requested, holds land that borders your new holdings." Silence. Rowan felt a fierce pride surge through him. She'd done exactly what he should have done months ago, connected the dots, seen the pattern, prepared her defense. "You have an active imagination, Your Grace," Sterling said finally, "but imagination isn't evidence." "No, but this might be." The rustle of paper. "These are copies of land survey maps showing your purchases over the past year, alongside a list of every tenant petition I've made on behalf of. The overlap is striking. Every single tenant whose land you want has benefited from my advocacy, and now you're trying to silence me with false charges. Those maps prove nothing, Bennett cut in. Coincidence isn't conspiracy. True. Which is why I was so interested to learn about your history, Mr. Bennett. Did you know that in the past 3 years you've investigated 17 cases of alleged corruption among minor nobility, and that in 14 of those cases, the charges were dropped after the targets agreed to sell land or make financial concessions to the very people who initially brought the accusations? You're making serious allegations. I'm stating facts. Facts I've documented thoroughly. Facts that the real Crown prosecutors might find very interesting if these charges against me proceed. Rowan wanted to cheer. She'd turned the trap around on them, had done in hours of research what should have been done from the beginning. But he could hear the anger building in Sterling's voice, and anger made men unpredictable. You think you're clever, Sterling said, his pretense of civility dropping away. You think having documents and making accusations will protect you? You're a disgraced duchess living in a cottage because your own husband couldn't stand the sight of you. No one will believe your word over ours. Perhaps not, but they might believe the Duke of Ashcroft's word. And he's reviewed all my evidence and found it compelling. The Duke abandoned you here. He won't. The Duke is my husband, and despite our current circumstances, he has a vested interest in protecting the family name from scandal, which is exactly what you're threatening to create. The fourth man spoke for the first time, his voice cultured and cold. Your Grace, I am Mr. Pembroke, solicitor for Mr. Sterling. Perhaps we can discuss a compromise. You cease your tenant advocacy, and we withdraw the charges. Everyone walks away satisfied. Except the tenants who lose their homes, Eliza said quietly. The tenants are not your concern. They absolutely are my concern. They're people depending on me to speak for them. I won't betray that trust for my own convenience. Even if it means prosecution, prison, complete social ruin? Pembroke's voice took on a threatening edge. Because that's what will happen, Your Grace. We have witnesses who will testify that you explicitly solicited payments in exchange for advocacy. We have documentation of every gift you received. We can make this case, and we will win it. Your witnesses are lying, Eliza's voice hardened, and I think you know that. I think all of this, the charges, the investigation, the threats, is designed to frighten me into silence because you're running out of time. The tenant leases are coming up for renewal in 2 months, and if they're extended, your entire land scheme falls apart. You're right about one thing, Sterling said, his voice turning ugly. We are running out of time, which is why we're done being polite. Rowan heard movement, chairs scraping, heavy footsteps. He was already moving toward the door when he heard Eliza's sharp intake of breath. What are you doing? Ensuring your cooperation, Sterling replied. Bennett, show her the amended charges. These documents allege not just corruption, but also inciting unrest among the tenant population and interfering with lawful commerce. The penalties include immediate imprisonment pending trial. You can't do this. We can do whatever we want, Your Grace. You have no husband here to protect you, no family with influence. You're alone, and you're going to sign a statement agreeing to cease all tenant advocacy, or you're going to be arrested right now. Rowan hit the cottage door with enough force to splinter the frame. It crashed open, and he stood in the entrance with his pistol drawn. She's not alone, he said quietly, and you're not going to touch her. The room erupted into chaos. The hired men reached for weapons, but Rowan was faster, cocking the pistol and aiming directly at Sterling. I wouldn't, he said, his voice deadly calm. Tell your men to stand down, or I will put a bullet in you right here. You wouldn't dare. Test me. Rowan's finger tightened on the trigger. I've wanted an excuse to shoot you since yesterday. Please give me one. Sterling went pale. He gestured to his men, who slowly raised their hands. Good. Rowan stepped fully into the cottage, keeping the gun trained on Sterling. Eliza, are you hurt? No. Her voice was shaky but steady. I'm fine. Then step outside. Anderson and his men are waiting. Eliza moved quickly to the door, and Rowan heard her call out. Within seconds, the cottage was surrounded by a dozen villagers, Anderson at the front with a nasty-looking cudgel. You're making a mistake, Bennett said, trying to regain composure. Threatening a crown officer is a serious crime. You're not a crown officer. You're a corrupt extortionist. Rowan glanced at the papers scattered on the table. And those amended charges? Pure fiction. There's no legal basis for any of this, and you know it. It doesn't matter what's legal, Sterling spat. It matters what we can prove, what we can make people believe. Then let's talk about proof. Rowan smiled without humor. Because while you were in here threatening my wife, a real Crown investigator was at your office in the county seat executing a search warrant. They're going through all your correspondence, all your financial records, looking for evidence of exactly the kind of corruption you've been practicing. Sterling's face went ashen. You're lying. I sent word last night after finding evidence of arson at the church. When Crown investigators hear that a magistrate may have burned down a church to intimidate witnesses, they tend to take it seriously. Rowan moved closer, his voice dropping. It's over, Sterling. You're done. You can cooperate and perhaps avoid the worst consequences, or you can keep lying and face the full weight of justice. You have no proof of arson. We have oil stains and burn patterns that clearly show deliberate fire setting. We have the timing, just hours after I threatened you for trying to extort my wife. We have motive. You wanted to prove how vulnerable the village was, how much they needed to cooperate with you. Rowan's voice hardened. And we have testimony from one of your hired men who was very eager to talk once we offered him immunity. That was a bluff. Rowan hadn't gotten any testimony yet, but Sterling didn't know that, and the man's expression crumbled. I didn't mean it wasn't supposed to burn that hot, just scare them a little. You just confessed to arson, Rowan said flatly, in front of multiple witnesses. Sterling seemed to realize what he'd done. He looked around wildly, seeing the faces in the doorway, the villagers who'd heard everything. Pembroke was already edging toward the exit, clearly wanting distance from his client. This isn't over, Sterling tried one last time. You might have stopped me, but there are others. The tenants will still lose their land eventually. You can't protect everyone forever. Maybe not forever, Eliza said, stepping back into the cottage doorway. But I can protect them today, and tomorrow, and every day after that for as long as it takes. She held up the documents Sterling and Bennett had brought, the false charges, the fabricated witness statements. These are evidence of your corruption, along with your confession to arson, witnessed by everyone here. You're going to withdraw every charge against me, every claim you've made. You're going to sell your land holdings back to the Crown at cost. And you're going to leave this county and never return. And if I refuse, then my husband will ensure you hang for arson and attempted extortion of a peer. Eliza's voice was iron. Your choice. Sterling looked between them, the Duchess he'd tried to intimidate and the Duke he'd underestimated. Slowly his shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine. I'll withdraw everything. Just let me leave. Leave and never come back, Rowan said. If I see you anywhere near my lands or my wife again, the deal is off. Sterling and his men fled, practically running to their carriage. Bennett followed, though he paused at the door. For what it's worth, Your Grace, he said to Eliza, I was just doing my job. Your job was to seek justice, not profit from corruption, she replied coldly. You failed, spectacularly. After they were gone, the cottage fell silent. Anderson and the villagers dispersed slowly, talking among themselves in excited voices. Soon, only Rowan and Eliza remained, standing amid the overturned furniture and scattered papers. You lied about having testimony from one of the hired men, Eliza said quietly. I did. Was that wrong? It was brilliant. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd given him since his arrival. You saved me. Again. You saved yourself. I just provided the intimidation and the bluff. Rowan set his pistol down carefully. That research you did, those documents connecting Sterling's purchases to your advocacy, when did you have time to gather all that? I didn't. I had suspicions, and I made educated guesses based on the timing of his accusations. Most of what I said was extrapolation. She shook her head. I was terrified he'd call my bluff. You didn't show it. Neither did you. Eliza moved to the table, gathering up the scattered papers. We make a good team when we're actually working together instead of against each other. The observation hung between them, weighted with months of pain and missed opportunities. Eliza, Rowan said carefully, about what I said yesterday, about wanting you to return to the manor. I've been thinking about that. She didn't look at him, focusing intently on organizing the documents. About what it would mean to go back there, to try to rebuild something from the ruins of what we had. And I'm terrified. She finally met his eyes. I'm terrified that you'll wake up one day and decide you were wrong again. That this faith you have in me now will evaporate like it did before. I'm terrified of trusting you and having my heart broken again. I understand. But I'm also terrified of saying no, she continued, of walking away from the possibility of something real. Because despite everything, despite the pain and the loneliness and the anger, I still... She stopped, struggling with the words. I still want to believe in the person I thought you could be. The person I saw glimpses of on our wedding day, before it all fell apart. Rowan felt something crack open in his chest. I want to be that person. I want to be worthy of your faith. But I don't know how to prove it beyond what I've already done. Then don't prove it all at once. Eliza set down the papers and turned to face him fully. Start small. Court me, like you said. Show me through actions, over time, that you've truly changed. Give me space to heal while also giving us chances to rebuild. Can you do that? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Whatever you need, whatever pace you set, I'll follow your lead. Even if it takes months, years? Even then. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or doubt. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. Then I'll return to the manor. Not as your wife, not yet, but as... She paused, considering, as a partner in managing the estate, someone you work with, consult with, gradually build trust with. We'll maintain separate chambers. We'll take things slowly. And if at any point I feel unsafe or unhappy, I can return here without judgment or consequence. Agreed. All of it. Rowan wanted to cross the room, to pull her into his arms, but he forced himself to stay still. This was her negotiation, her terms. When would you like to leave? After we handle the tenant leases and make sure the village is stable. After the school is properly established and Sarah knows how to run it without me. After... She smiled sadly. After I've said proper goodbyes to the people who became my family when I had no one else. Of course. Take all the time you need. They spent the next week working together in a way they never had before. Rowan stayed at the cottage, sleeping in the inn but spending his days with Eliza, and they tackled the tenant lease renewals together. He brought the actual contracts and documentation. She brought her knowledge of individual circumstances and needs. Together they crafted agreements that protected tenant rights while keeping the estate financially sound. The villagers watched this partnership with cautious approval. They saw their duke actually listening to his duchess, saw him defer to her judgment on matters she understood better. They saw a couple learning to work together, to trust each other, to build something new from broken pieces. On the 5th day, a carriage arrived from London. Mrs. Pemberton emerged, followed by several maids carrying trunks. Your Grace, she curtsied to Eliza. The Duke sent word that you'd be returning to the manor. I've brought appropriate clothing and staff to assist with your move. Eliza looked at Rowan, one eyebrow raised. You were very confident I'd say yes. I was hopeful, he corrected, and prepared to send them back if you refused. That evening, the village held an impromptu farewell gathering in the square. It wasn't formal or elaborate, just people bringing food and ale, children running about, everyone wanting to mark the occasion. Sarah presented Eliza with a shawl she'd knitted, to remember us by. I could never forget you, Eliza said, tears streaming down her face. Any of you, you saved my life in ways you'll never fully understand. You saved ours too, Anderson replied. Gave us hope that maybe nobility could care about more than just their own wealth. Don't forget that when you're back in your grand manor. I won't, I promise. She said goodbye to each child she'd taught, hugging them and reminding them to keep practicing their letters. She thanked the families who'd helped her learn to survive, to cook and clean and tend gardens. She promised to visit often, to maintain the school, to never abandon them. And through it all, Rowan watched and finally understood what he'd almost destroyed. Eliza wasn't just a woman of noble birth who'd been kind to peasants. She was someone who'd found her purpose in service, who'd discovered that meaning came not from social position, but from genuine connection and mutual care. She'd become the kind of person he'd once aspired to be, before bitterness had frozen his capacity for trust. The journey back to Ashcroft Manor took half a day. Eliza sat across from Rowan in the carriage, watching the familiar landscape roll by. She'd traveled this road in the opposite direction months ago, exiled and heartbroken. Now she was returning, but everything had changed. When the manor came into view, massive and imposing against the evening sky, she felt a flutter of anxiety. "Having second thoughts?" Rowan asked gently. "Just remembering the last time I was here, how it felt to be sent away before I'd even unpacked my trunks." "That won't happen again. You have my word." "Words are easy, Rowan. Then judge me by my actions." He leaned forward. "Starting with this, we're not entering through the servant's entrance or hiding your return. We're going through the front door together, and I'm going to introduce you to the staff properly as the Duchess of Ashcroft, who will be taking an active role in estate management." True to his word, when they arrived, the entire household staff was assembled in the main hall. Mrs. Pemberton stood at the front, her expression carefully neutral. "Everyone," Rowan said clearly, his voice carrying through the space, "I want to introduce you properly to your Duchess. Some of you met her briefly at our wedding, but circumstances I take full responsibility for, prevented her from taking her rightful place here. That changes today." He turned to Eliza, offering his arm. She took it, and together they descended from the carriage and climbed the manor steps. "The Duchess of Ashcroft will be managing tenant relations and overseeing new educational initiatives in the villages. She speaks with my full authority on these matters. Any requests or concerns she raises are to be treated as if they came from me directly. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, Your Grace" rippled through the staff. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward. "Welcome home, Your Grace. Your chambers are prepared." "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton." Eliza's voice was steady, though her heart raced. "I appreciate your discretion and help these past months." The housekeeper's expression softened. "It's good to have you here, Your Grace." "Properly here." That night, Eliza stood in the Duchess's chambers, the same rooms she'd occupied for mere hours on her wedding night, and tried to process everything that had happened. The rooms had been thoroughly cleaned and updated. Fresh flowers filled vases, and a fire burned cheerfully in the hearth. But she was still alone. A knock at the door made her turn. Rowan stood in the hallway, changed into evening clothes, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen from him. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," he said. "I do. Thank you. And to give you this." He held out a small wooden box. "It belonged to my mother. I thought you should have it." Eliza took the box carefully and opened it. Inside was a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. "She wore it every day," Rowan said quietly, "until she left. I kept it all these years, couldn't bring myself to look at it. But you should have something of hers. Something to mark your place in this family." "Rowan." Eliza didn't know what to say. This was more than a gift. It was trust, vulnerability, a piece of his guarded past offered freely. "You asked once what happened to her, what made me so afraid of trusting." He moved into the room but kept his distance. "She married my father for love, or so everyone thought. For 5 years they seemed happy. Then one day she disappeared, took all her jewels, most of the portable valuables, and ran off with a stable hand she'd been carrying on with for years." Eliza's hand went to her throat. "Rowan, I'm sorry. My father never recovered. He loved her completely, and her betrayal destroyed him. I watched him waste away from heartbreak, and I swore I'd never let anyone have that kind of power over me." He met her eyes. "But I was wrong. Not trusting isn't protection. It's just another kind of prison. You showed me that." "I didn't mean to." "I know. You were just being yourself, being honest and kind and brave, even when it would have been easier to give up, even when I gave you every reason to hate me." He took a breath. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand. My fear wasn't about you. It was about my own damage, my own inability to believe in good things. And I let that fear destroy something precious before it even had a chance to grow." Eliza clutched the locket, feeling its weight in her palm. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry for what I did to you. And I'm saying that I'm grateful for this second chance, even though I don't deserve it. And I'm saying that I will spend however long it takes proving that you can trust me. Not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with consistent daily actions that show you're valued and protected and cherished. The words hung between them, honest and raw and more vulnerable than anything he'd said before. "I can't promise I'll heal quickly," Eliza said finally, "or that this will work the way we both hope." "I know. But I can promise I'll try. I'll give this partnership a real chance, and maybe, if we're both patient and honest, we can build something better than what we lost." "I'll take maybe," Rowan smiled, and it transformed his usually severe face. "Maybe is more than I had yesterday." He left after that, closing the door softly behind him. Eliza stood alone in her chambers, holding her mother-in-law's locket, and felt the weight of possibility settling over her. This wouldn't be easy. Trust, once shattered, was difficult to rebuild. But for the first time since her wedding night, she felt hope. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Rowan and Eliza took breakfast together each morning, discussing estate business and tenant concerns. She introduced him to people whose names he'd never learned, whose struggles he'd never seen. He gave her access to ledgers and accounts, asked her opinion on investments and improvements, actually listened when she spoke. They rode out to Thornfield twice a week, checking on the school and meeting with villagers. Rowan was learning what Eliza had known for months, that the people on his land were more than numbers in a ledger, that their lives and struggles mattered, that being a good landlord meant more than collecting rents on time. And slowly, carefully, they were learning each other. Eliza discovered that Rowan played piano beautifully, but rarely did so because his mother had taught him, and it brought back painful memories. She learned that he rode out alone every morning, not because he was antisocial, but because it was the only time he felt truly free. She saw glimpses of the man beneath the armor, someone who'd been hurt young and had spent his life protecting that wound. Rowan learned that Eliza had a wicked sense of humor that only emerged when she felt safe. He discovered her passion for literature and history, watched her face light up when discussing ancient Rome or medieval England. He saw her cry over a tenant's sick child and rage over injustice to the powerless, and he fell a little more in love with her every day. But they maintained their boundaries, separate chambers, formal interactions in public, a careful distance that protected them both. Until the night of the county ball. It was Eliza's first major social appearance since returning to the manor. Society had been buzzing with speculation about the duchess who'd disappeared after her wedding and suddenly reappeared months later. The rumors ranged from scandal to illness to everything in between. "We don't have to go," Rowan said as they prepared to leave. "If you're not ready to face them, I'm ready." Eliza smoothed her gown, a deep emerald silk that made her eyes luminous. "Besides, you promised to defend me publicly. I want to see you make good on that promise." The ballroom fell silent when they entered. Every eye turned toward them, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Eliza felt the weight of their stares, their judgments, their hungry curiosity. Rowan offered his arm, and together they descended the stairs. Lady Pembroke, the elderly woman who'd warned Eliza about Rowan at the wedding, approached immediately. "Your Grace, how wonderful to see you looking so well." "Thank you, Lady Pembroke." Eliza kept her voice steady. "I've been staying in the country. It's been restorative." "I'm sure." The woman's eyes gleamed with barely suppressed curiosity. "There have been so many rumors, all false, I assure you." Rowan's voice cut through the chatter. "My wife has been establishing educational programs in our villages and dramatically improving tenant relations. She's been doing the work I should have been doing for years." A ripple of shock ran through the nearby guests. Dukes didn't usually admit fault, especially not publicly. "How commendable," someone murmured. "More than commendable. Essential." Rowan's hand tightened on Eliza's arm. "I want to make something very clear to everyone here. My wife is not exiled. She is not in disgrace. She is the Duchess of Ashcroft with all the rights and authority that entails. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The ballroom was utterly silent now. This was unprecedented. A duke publicly defending his wife, admitting mistakes, asserting her authority. "Furthermore," Rowan continued, "the rumors about our separation were my fault entirely. I made assumptions without evidence and judgments without mercy. My wife has shown more grace in forgiving me than I deserved." Eliza squeezed his arm, warning him not to say more. They'd agreed on defending her, but this level of public confession went beyond that. But Rowan was done hiding. She is the finest person I know, and if any of you doubt that, you're welcome to visit our villages and see the schools she's built, the lives she's improved, the respect she's earned through genuine service rather than empty titles. The silence broke into whispers, then murmurs, then actual conversation. Lady Pembroke looked between them, her expression shifting from curiosity to something like approval. "Well," she said finally, "that's quite a declaration, Your Grace. It's the truth." Rowan looked down at Eliza. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. They took the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz, and suddenly they were dancing as they had on their wedding night. But everything was different now. "That was more than we discussed," Eliza said quietly as they moved through the steps. "I know. Was it too much?" "It was perfect." She felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me, for risking your own reputation to defend mine. It wasn't a risk. It was simply the truth." His hand at her waist pulled her slightly closer. "And I should have said it months ago." They danced until the music ended, and then they danced again. And through it all, society watched and whispered and slowly, grudgingly, began to accept that perhaps the Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft were writing a different story than the one everyone had expected. That night, back at the manor, Eliza stood at her chamber window looking out over the grounds. A knock at the connecting door, the door between her rooms and Rowan's, made her turn. "Come in," she called. Rowan entered, still in his evening clothes, his expression uncertain. "I wanted to check on you. Tonight was intense." "It was, but good, necessary," she smiled. "You were remarkable. What you said about me, about us, it meant more than you know." "I meant every word." They stood there separated by 10 feet of carpet that might as well have been a chasm. The air between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Rowan," Eliza said quietly, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "To try, really try, not just as partners managing an estate, but as," she struggled for the words, "as husband and wife, to see if maybe that affection I hoped for has a chance to grow." Rowan crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "Are you sure? Because I don't want to rush you. I don't want—" She kissed him. It was soft and tentative and nothing like the brief cold press of lips at their wedding. This was real. This was choice. When they broke apart, Rowan's eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you," he said. "I've loved you since I watched you teach those children in your cottage, maybe even before that. I love your strength and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to give up. I love that you became who you are despite everything I did to break you. I love you too." The words surprised her, but they were true. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But somewhere between the exile and the fire and the partnership, I fell in love with the person you're becoming. Not who you were, but who you're choosing to be." They stood holding each other as the moon rose over the estate, 2 people who'd found their way back from the edge of destruction to something that felt like salvation. The months that followed were filled with hard work and slow healing. Eliza maintained the schools in Thornfield and 3 other villages. Rowan overhauled his entire approach to estate management, actually visiting his tenants and learning their concerns. Together, they built a partnership that became the model for progressive estate management throughout the county. On the anniversary of their wedding, Rowan did something he'd been planning for months. He took Eliza to the cottage in Thornfield, which had been maintained exactly as she'd left it, and got down on one knee. "I know we're already married," he said, "but I never really asked you, never gave you the choice. So I'm asking now. Eliza Ashcroft, will you marry me? Not because of debts or family pressure or social expectation, but because you want to, because you choose me, knowing all my flaws and failures." "Yes." She was crying and laughing at the same time. "Yes, I choose you. I choose us." They remarried in a small ceremony in Thornfield, with the villagers as witnesses. It wasn't grand or elaborate, but it was real. It was theirs. Years later, visitors to Ashcroft Manor would remark on the unusual partnership between the Duke and Duchess. They would note how Eliza spoke in meetings with the same authority as Rowan, how he deferred to her judgment on tenant matters, how they moved through the world as true partners rather than lord and subordinate. They would hear stories about the duchess, who'd been exiled but had turned her exile into opportunity, who'd built schools and fought corruption and ran into burning buildings to save the powerless. And they would see the duke, once known for his coldness and isolation, transformed into someone who actually cared about the people on his land, who valued compassion over control, who'd learned that strength meant vulnerability rather than armor. But the most remarkable thing, the thing that people would talk about for generations, was the way Rowan looked at Eliza. Like she was the sun, and he was seeing light for the first time. Like she'd saved him from drowning in his own bitterness. Which, in a way, she had. On quiet mornings, they would sit together in the manor's library, reviewing petitions and planning improvements, their hands occasionally touching across the desk. In the evenings, they would walk the grounds, discussing the day's challenges and victories. And at night, in the chambers they now shared, Rowan would hold Eliza close and marvel that he'd almost lost her, that his fear and pride had nearly destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him. "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked one such night, sensing his thoughts. "That I was the luckiest unlucky man alive. Unlucky enough to nearly ruin everything, but lucky enough to get a second chance." "We both got second chances. That's the beauty of it." She kissed him softly. "We get to choose each other every day. Not just once in a ceremony, but constantly, through our actions and decisions and commitment." "Then I choose you," Rowan said. "Today and tomorrow and every day after that." "And I choose you." Outside their window, the moon shone over the estate, over the manor and the villages, the schools and the tenant farms, the land they protected together. It illuminated a world transformed not by power or wealth, but by two people who'd learned that love meant more than passion. It meant partnership, sacrifice, and the courage to change. In the cottage at Thornfield, a light still burned. Sarah Miller had taken over the main teaching duties, but Eliza visited every week, maintaining her connection to the place that had saved her. The children she'd taught years ago were grown now, many teaching their own children using the books and methods Eliza had introduced. The village had prospered under the Duke's reform management. Roofs were repaired, rents were fair, and tenants knew they had advocates in the manor who actually listened to their concerns. And in London, in the drawing rooms where society still gossiped over tea, the story of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft had become something different. Not a scandal or a cautionary tale, but a love story. A story about second chances and earned redemption. About a woman who'd survived exile and a man who'd learned to trust again. About two people who'd been broken by circumstance and fear, but who'd found the courage to rebuild themselves and each other into something stronger than what they'd been before. It was, they would say in years to come, the kind of love that changed not just two lives, but an entire estate. The kind that proved redemption was possible, that people could change, that exile could become opportunity. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in power or control, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to trust again after betrayal, to choose love even when fear demands protection. Eliza had learned that truth in her cottage, in the cold months of exile when she'd built a life from nothing. Rowan had learned it by watching her, by finally seeing what mattered, and together they'd built something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of compassion, partnership, and the transformative power of second chances. In the grand manor where their story had nearly ended before it began, they lived out their days in a love that had been tested by fire and exile, pride and fear, and had emerged stronger for every trial. They had fought for each other when fighting seemed impossible. They had chosen trust when every instinct screamed to protect themselves. They had built a marriage not on the false foundation of a single ceremony, but on the daily choice to see each other, value each other, and grow together. And in the end, that was worth more than any fortune, any title, any social standing could ever be. It was, simply and profoundly, enough.